Chapter 19, Part 1 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 19, Part 1. International Circumpolar Stations. Failure of Dutch Expedition. Greely Expedition reaches Lady Franklin Bay. Life at Fort Conger. Sledge journey of Brainerd and Lockwood. Farthest north. Greely's journey to interior of Grinnell Land. Lake Hazen. Failure of relief ship Neptune to reach Conger in 1882. Official plans for Greely's relief in 1883. Proteus crushed in ice. Garlington's retreat. Greely's abandonment of Fort Conger. Greely reaches Cape Sabine. The beginning of a hard winter. Death of members of the party from starvation and cold. Shay's brilliant rescue of the remnant of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition in 1884. The plan for establishing international circumpolar stations within or near the Arctic Circle for the purpose of recording a complete series of synchronous meteorological and magnetic observations was outlined in a well-thought-out paper delivered by Lieutenant Karl Weyprecht, A.H. Navy, before the German Scientific and Medical Association of Graz in September 1875, soon after the return from his remarkable journey in the Tegethoff. Though Lieutenant Weyprecht did not live to see his splendid scheme carried into effect, the cooperation of Prince Bismarck and the hearty endorsement of the plan by a commission of eminent scientists, as well as the decision of the International Meteorological Congress, which reported that these observations will be of the highest importance in developing meteorology and in extending our knowledge of terrestrial magnetism, resulted in the International Polar Conference at Hamburg, October 1, 1879, in which 11 nations were represented, and a second conference at Bern, August 7, 1880, at which it was decided that each nation should establish one or more stations where synchronous observations should be taken from August 1882. With the exception of the Dutch expedition, the scheme was successfully carried out and the stations established without accident. Norwegians, Boskov, Allen Fjord, Norway, under direction of M. Axel S. Steen. Swedes, Ice Fjord, Spitsbergen, under direction of Mr. Ekholm. Russians, Sagaster Island, mouth of Lena, Siberia, under Lieutenant Jurgits. Russians, Muller Bay, Nova Zembla, under Lieutenant Andreev. Americans, Port Barrow, North America, under Lieutenant Ray, U.S. Army. Americans, Lady Franklin Bay, 81 degrees 44 minutes north, under Lieutenant A.W. Greely, U.S. Army. English, Great Slave Lake, Dominion of Canada, under Lieutenant Dawson. German, Cumberland Bay, west side of Davis Strait, under Dr. Giese. Danes, Gotthard, Greenland, under A. Paulson. Austrian, Jan Mayen, North Atlantic, 71 degrees north, under Lieutenant Volkemuth, A.H. Navy. As to the unsuccessful Dutch expedition, the Varna sailed from Amsterdam July 5, 1882, bound for Dixon Harbor, but was beset in the Kara Sea in September. She was crushed in December 1882 when the crew took refuge on board Lieutenant Hovgaard's vessel, the Dimphna, which had also been forced to winter in the pack. Nevertheless, Dr. Snellen did his utmost to procure regular observations from their besetment until the following August, when they started by boat and sledge for the coast of Nova Zembla. By August 25th, they reached the south point of Regat Island, where they met the Nordenskjold and were safely landed in Hammerfest, September 1st, 1883. The inestimable value of the combined and systematic record of the scientific observations secured by the international circumpolar stations is a matter of public record. The success was complete, and all but the American nation might well be proud of the management and protection offered to the fearless men detailed to the splendid work. The unparalleled disaster which overtook the Lady Franklin Bay expedition under Lieutenant Greely and his brave companions, through no fault of their own, but by a series of mismanaged accidents, for which there was neither excuse nor condonation, leaves a blot upon the American records which the centuries cannot obliterate. If the simple and necessary precaution had been taken, writes Markham, brother of the famous explorer, of stationing a depot ship in a good harbor at the entrance of Smith Sound, in annual communication with Greely on one side and with America on the other, there would have been no disaster. And he continues, if precautions prove to be necessary by experience are taken, there is no undue risk or danger in polar enterprises. There is no question as to the value and importance of polar discovery and as to the principles on which expeditions should be sent out. Their objects are explorations for scientific purposes and the encouragement of maritime enterprise. Lieutenant Greely's party consisted of 3 officers besides the commander, 19 men of the army, including an astronomer, a photographer, and meteorologist, and 2 Eskimos. Sailing from St. John's, Newfoundland, July 7, 1881, they were conveyed in the sealer Proteus to Littleton Island, where they hunted up the male of the Alert and Discovery, then proceeded in open water to Cape Lieber, 81 degrees 37 minutes north. There the ship was delayed by encountering ice in Hall Basin. By August 11th, she had pushed through and safely landed the party at the old winter quarters of the Discovery in 1875 to 1876. Immediate preparations were made for building a house, and after all supplies were landed, the Proteus sailed home, leaving Lieutenant Greely and his party at Fort Conger. Indications of approaching winter appeared as early as August 27th, and the season proved one of unusual severity. Sledge journeys, hunting parties, and exploring trips, combined with regular duties, scientific observations, exercise, and moderate amusements, ensured the party a season of successful labor and good health. Traveling in one instance a week, in another 10 days, in frightful temperatures averaging 73 degrees below freezing, Lieutenant Lockwood and Dr. O. Pavey, surgeon of the expedition, with their companions, endured the severity with surprising energy. The ice conditions of Robeson Channel were ascertained and depots established at Cape Sumner for use in the following spring. The sun left on October 15th and was absent 135 days. The curious effect upon the mind produced by the long Arctic night is recorded in December. About the 10th, writes Lieutenant Greely in his report, a few of the men gave indications of being affected by the continual darkness, But such signs soon disappeared and cheerful spirits returned. The Eskimos appeared to be the most affected. On the 13th, Jens Edward disappeared, leaving the station in early morning without mittens and without breakfast. Sending 2 parties with lanterns to describe a half-mile circle around the station, his tracks were soon found leading towards the straits. He was at once pursued and was overtaken about 10 miles from the station near Cape Murchison. He returned to the station without objection and in time recovered his spirits. No cause for his action in this respect could be ascertained. Dr. Pavey, who had spent the previous year among the Eskimos, said that this state of mind was not infrequent among the natives of Lower Greenland and often resulted in the wandering off of the subjects of it, and if not followed, by their perishing in the cold. As early as February 19, 1882, Lockwood and Brainerd made a dog sledge trip to one of the depots deposited the previous autumn, a journey over the foot ice of 20 miles. On the 29th of February, Lieutenant Lockwood, accompanied by Brainerd, 4 other men, and 2 dog teams, made an experimental trip to Thank God Harbor preparatory to his proposed grand expedition along the coast to northern Greenland. Visiting the grave of Charles Francis Hall, Lockwood wrote in his journal the following touching tribute. The headboard erected by his comrades, as also the metallic one left by the English, still stands. How mournful to me the scene, made more so by the howling of the winds and the thick atmosphere. It was doubtless best that he died where he did. I have come to regard him as a visionary and an enthusiast, who was indebted more to fortune than to those practical abilities which Cain possessed. Yet he gave his life to the cause, and that must always go far toward redeeming the shortcomings of any man. The concluding lines of the inscription on the English tablet I think good. To Captain Hall, who sacrificed his life in the advancement of science. November 8, 1871. This tablet has been erected by the British Polar Expedition of 1875, which followed in his footsteps and profited by his experience. Dr. Pavey, accompanied by Sergeant Rice and Eskimo Jens with a dog sledge, started March 19, 1882, for the north of Grinnell Land. A supporting sledge under Sergeant Jewell accompanied him as far as Lincoln Bay. On April 1st, an unfortunate accident to the sledge runner caused a 5 days' delay at Cape Union. Sergeant Rice and Eskimo Jens made a forced march back to Fort Conger and secured a new runner. Storms retarded their advance, but in spite of the rough condition of the ice, all supplies were brought up to Cape Joseph Henry and left there April 20th. 2 days later, a violent storm set in, and after it subsided, the party pushed on toward Cape Hecla. A lane of open water was seen extending from Crozier Island round Cape Hecla. As this channel rapidly increased in width, a retreat was decided on, but to his consternation, before land could be reached, Dr. Pavey found himself adrift on a floe in the polar ocean. Fortunately, the floe was driven against the land near Cape Henry, and after abandoning all articles not absolutely indispensable, he escaped to the mainland, but was obliged to give up further explorations. In the meantime, Lieutenant Lockwood had completed his preparations, and the advance party, consisting of Sergeant Brainerd and 9 men dragging 4 Hudson Bay sledges, left Fort Conger April 3, 1882, to be followed the next day by Lieutenant Lockwood with 2 men and 1 dog sledge, under instructions to explore the coast of Greenland near Cape Britannia in such direction as he thought best to carry out the objects of the main expedition, the extension of knowledge regarding lands within the Arctic Circle. The 5th of April, Lockwood joined the advance party at Depot A. On the afternoon of the 8th, they reached Cape Sumner. Bags of pemmican were added to the sledge loads for dog food. The parties encountered violent gales and extreme cold, 81 degrees below freezing, as they pushed on to Newman Bay. The hard experience of sledge travel was already telling upon the men, and at this point 4 were sent back, being unfit for continued field work. Pushing on for Repulse Harbor with 300 rations and 8 men, Lockwood advanced in the face of storms, rough ice, and broken sledges at the average rate of 9 miles per day. The men suffered much from snow blindness and the unwanted fatigue of dragging the heavy sledges through areas of soft, deep snow. At Cape Bryant, which was reached April 27th, a rest of 2 days was taken, during which Brainerd, with 2 companions, visited the highest point of Cape Tolford. On the 29th of May, Lieutenant Lockwood sent back the supporting sledgemen and, with Brainerd and the Eskimo Christensen, the dog sledge and 25 days' rations, pursued his journey north across the polar ocean to Cape Britannia, which was reached May 5th after 6 journeys, the last a very short one. From the top of the mountains, 2,050 feet, writes Lockwood, which forms Cape Britannia, I got a good view all around. Towards the northeast lay a succession of headlands and inlets as far as I could see, some 15 or 20 miles, and this was the character of the coast beyond as far as I got. They had followed out the letter of their instructions and had reached the destination mentioned therein, but finding it possible to continue their explorations, they pushed on over land never before explored by man, crossing the frozen ocean and reaching Mary Murray Island the 10th of May. The party were now suffering from cold and insufficient food. To husband their rations, they had eaten very little of late. The dogs were ravenous for food, and when feeding time came, it was amid blows from the men and fights among the dogs that the distribution was made. In spite of serious delays by violent wind and storms, by floes so high that the sledge was lowered by dog traces, by ice so rough as to necessitate the use of the axe before they could advance, and by widening water cracks which delayed their progress, these men pushed boldly on, and on May 15, 1882, made a world's record, reaching on that day Lockwood Island, 83 degrees 24 minutes north latitude, 42 degrees 46 minutes west longitude. Gaining a considerable elevation, Lockwood unfurled Mrs. Greeley's pretty little silken flag, and for the first time in 275 years, another nation than England claimed the honors of the farthest north, and the Union Jack gave way to the Stars and Stripes. From this point, the most northerly land seen was Cape Washington. Beyond, to the north, lay an unbroken expanse of ice, interrupted only by the horizon. Haven Coast trended to the northeast in a succession of high, rocky, and precipitous promontories. Evidences of vegetation and game were found in this high latitude. Lemmings, ptarmigan, foxes, and hares found their way to these desolate shores, and small plants struggled for a foothold in the uncongenial soil. As we think of Lockwood, writes Charles Lanman, his biographer, at the end of his journey with only 2 companions in that land of utter desolation, we are struck with admiration at the courage and manly spirit by which he was inspired. Biting cold, fearful storms, gloomy darkness, the dangers of starvation and sickness, all combined to block his ice pathway. And yet he persevered and accomplished his heroic purpose, thereby winning a place in history of which his countrymen may well and will be proud to the end of time. The return was even more arduous than the advance, and as they pursued their weary trail, thoughts wandered to home and creature comforts. What thoughts one has when thus plodding along, writes Lockwood in his journal. Home and everything there, and the scenes and incidents of early youth. Home again when this Arctic experience shall be a thing of the past. But it must be confessed, and lamentable it is, as well as true, that the reminiscences to which my thoughts often most recur on these occasions are connected with eating. The favorite dishes I have enjoyed, while in dreams of the future, my thoughts turn from other contemplations to the discussion of beefsteak, and equally absurd to whether the stew and tea at our next supper will be hot or cold. Joining the supporting party at Cape Sumner, the entire party, suffering from exhaustion and snowblindness, reached Fort Conquer June 1st, 1882. During the absence of Lockwood, Lieutenant Greely had left Fort Conquer April 26, 1882, and penetrated Grinnell Land, reaching Lake Hazen, a glacial lake, some 500 square miles in area. Lake Hazen was again visited by Greely in June. Following up Very River to its source, the farthest reached was 175 miles from the home station, between Mount C.A. Arthur and Mount C.S. Smith, which evidently formed the divide of Grinnell Land, between Kennedy Channel to the east and the Polar Ocean to the west. Ascending Mount C.A. Arthur, the highest peak of Grinnell Land, Greely stood 4,500 feet above the sea and saw to the north of Lake Hazen snow-clad mountains, and distant country to the southwest was also covered with eternal snows. Lieutenant Lockwood subsequently supplemented Greely's discoveries of the interior of Grinnell Land, with the result that jointly 6,000 square miles of territory was examined, an accomplishment which determines the remarkable physical conditions of North Grinnell Land. It brought to light fertile valleys supporting herds of musk oxen, and extensive ice cap, rivers of considerable size, and a glacial lake Hazen of extensive area. Traces of Eskimos having wintered at Lake Hazen, as shown by permanent huts, were a source of surprise to the explorers. Successful to such a degree as were these geographical explorations, writes Greeley, they were strictly subordinated to the obligatory observations in the interests of the physical sciences. Systematic and unremitting magnetic observations served to round out knowledge by enabling scientists to calculate the secular variation of the magnetic declination of the Smith Sound region. Apart from the general value of the meteorological series, it has most fully determined the climatic conditions of Grinnell Land. The tidal observations were so complete at the station and so amply supplemented by outlying stations that scientists have determined not only the co-tidal lines of the polar ocean with satisfactory results, but also learned from them that the diurnal inequality of the tidal wave conforms at Fort Conger to the sidereal day. The pendulum observations have been classed as far the best that have ever been made within the Arctic Circle, and the determination of gravity therefrom has been singularly successful. Botanical, zoological, and anthropological researches were pursued with similar unremitting attention, so that the scientific work of the expedition may be considered as satisfactory and complete, especially in view of the high latitude of the station. Summer had passed, and though the men had scanned the horizon long and earnestly for promised relief, no ship reached them. A second winter passed in the slow monotony characteristic of the Arctic night. In order to facilitate his retreat in case the relief vessel of 1883 failed to reach him, Greeley laid down stores at Cape Baird before the sun returned in February 1883. Under his orders, Lieutenant Greeley was to abandon Fort Conger not later than September 1st and retreat southward by boat until he met the relief vessel, or Littleton Island was reached, where he would find a fresh party with fresh stores awaiting him. As early as December 2nd, 1881, active steps were taken at the War Department in Washington for the relief vessel of 1882. Estimates for an appropriation of $33,000 asked for, and negotiations for supplies opened with firms at St. John's and with the Danish government for stores to be delivered in Greenland. In May 1882, a board of officers attached to the Signal Service met at Washington to consider plans for the relief expedition, and the ultimate result was that the sailing from St. John's, Newfoundland, on July 8, 1882, of the sealing vessel Neptune, with Mr. William M. Beebe, Jr., a private in general service, and formerly secretary to the chief signal officer in charge of the relief work. The Neptune touched at Godhaven on the 17th and took on supplies, then directing her course slowly and with difficulty across Melville Bay, she came in sight of Cape York on the 25th. Littleton Island was reached on the 29th, where she was blocked by ice and obliged to return and anchor in Pandora Harbor. The next 40 days, the Neptune made fruitless efforts to enter Cane Sea. In the course of her many failures to penetrate to the north, she found anchorage between Cape Sabine, Brevoort Island, where Beebe examined the English cache made by the Discovery in 1875. This cache, of so much importance to Greely's men later, was found to contain 1 barrel of canned beef, 2 tins, 40 pounds each, of bacon, 1 barrel, 110 pounds, dog biscuit, 2 barrels, 120 rations each, biscuit, all in good condition. 240 rations consisting of chocolate and sugar, tea and sugar, potatoes, wicks, tobacco, salt, stearin, onion powder, and matches in fairly good condition. Beebe failed to leave any provisions of his own. On August 25th, after a 4th trial to penetrate the pack, the Neptune returned to Littleton Island with the intention of making depots. Natives being in the vicinity, who in all probability would steal any deposits left, Beebe concluded to postpone making the cache and proceeded to Cape Sabine. Here he deposited, according to his orders, 250 rations, 1/8 of a cord of birch wood, and a whale boat. The Neptune then made a 5th attempt to penetrate the pack, and again on September 2nd, her 6th and final effort. Finding it impossible to advance, she returned to Littleton Island, and a second depot of 250 rations was cached. She now started on her homeward voyage, September 5th, 1882. Beebe having carried out to the letter his instructions from the signal office for the relief of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, and left 2 depots of 250 rations, or 10 days' supply, returned to St. John's, carrying safely from the barren shores of the Arctic 2,000 rations, or a full supply for 3 months. The return of the relief party of 1882 made the expedition that was to follow the next summer one of grave importance. In the course of official communication on the subject between the chief signal officer and the Secretary of War, General Hazen stated that it is most desirable that the officer and the enlisted men who are to go next year be detailed as early as practicable in order that they may be trained and have experience in rowing and managing boats, and in the use of boat compasses. It is desirable that men be selected whose service has been in the Northwest, and it is also important that the entire party before going should be familiar with boats and their management under all conditions. In the Secretary's reply, the suggestion is volunteered. It seems that it would be much more desirable to endeavor to procure from the Navy the persons who are needed for this relief party. To this, General Hazen made answer: to change the full control of this duty now would be swapping horses while crossing the stream, and when in the middle of the stream. To manage it with mixed control, or even with mixed arms of the service under a single control, would be hazardous, and such action is strongly advised against by the many persons of both Army and Navy I have discussed the subject with. The ready knowledge of boats and instruments is but a very small part of the indispensable requisites in this case. This whole work has required a great deal of attention and study from the first, and I have not a doubt but that any transfer of control now would result in failure to convey all the threads of this half-finished work, and that it would work disastrously in many ways. In view of these facts, I would consider the transfer now of any part of the work to any other control as very hazardous and without any apparent promise of advantage. First Lieutenant Ernest A. Garlington of the 7th Cavalry having volunteered his services, was ordered February 6, 1883, to report at Washington. Since his graduation from the military academy in 1876, he had served with his regiment at Fort Buford, Dakota Territory. 4 enlisted men who had volunteered were also ordered from Dakota. The Proteus was chartered and made ready for her voyage. A request was made by the chief signal officer on the 14th of May that a Navy vessel should be detailed for service in connection with the expedition, as escort to bring back information, render assistance, and take such other steps as might be necessary in case of unforeseen emergencies. The Yantic, under Commander Frank Wilds, was selected and underwent such preparation as the limited time permitted. Garlington was instructed to examine, if possible, all depots of provisions and replace any damaged articles of food, and if the Proteus could not get through, the party and stores should be landed at Lifeboat Cove, the vessel sent back, and the party should remain. The Yantic was to accompany the Proteus as far as Littleton Island and render such assistance as might become necessary. Lieutenant J.C. Caldwell of the Navy, having volunteered his services, was detailed to accompany Garlington. The Proteus and the Yantic left St. John's the 29th of June, 1883, and were soon out of sight of each other. The Proteus encountered ice in Melville Bay. Garlington examined the Nares cache of 1,800 rations on southeast Gary Island, 60% of the rations proving to be in good condition. There is no record that the 40% were replaced from the Proteus's stores. Littleton Island was passed without a cache being left there. The ice prevented an advance, and Garlington thereupon decided to go to Cape Sabine to examine cache there, leave records, and await further developments. At 3:30, the Proteus came to anchor at Peary Harbor, Wright. She remained at her anchorage from 3:30 to 8 p.m. The stay of 4 hours and a half at Cape Sabine was a turning point in the history of the relief expedition. It was made up of golden moments. It is true that no one could predict that by that time next day the Proteus would be at the bottom of the Cane Sea. It is also true that Garlington's instructions had been officially construed as not including the formation of depots on the way north, and that the importance of reaching Lady Franklin Bay had been impressed upon his mind as the main purpose of his enterprise. At the same time, it was known with tolerable certainty that 2 months later Greeley would be at that point if he carried out his intentions. And the commander of the relief expedition, although not expressly directed to land anywhere, had been instructed that if landings should be made at points where caches of provisions were located, he was, if possible, to examine them and replace any damaged articles of food. Now there were 2 caches at or near Cape Sabine. One of them, left by Beebe the year before, was around the point of the cape. The other, left by Nares in 1875, was on Stalk-necked Island, a long, low rock in the harbor itself, due west from Brevoort Island and close to it. The position of the cache was well known. Beebe had visited it in 1882. The Proteus was now at Peary Harbor, probably within half a mile of Stalk-necked Island, and on board the vessel were the 4 depots of provisions, of 250 rations each that had been arranged at Disco to be in readiness for landing at some tune and at any time. Garlington ordered 2 privates to land and take a set of observations, while he went with a party of men to examine the caches. The repair of a cache and the set of observations are all the work reported as having been done at Cape Sabine on the way north. Garlington then put to sea and followed the open leads of water to the northward. After an advance of 20 miles, the ship was stopped by the pack near Cape Albert. The following day she was crushed, and the crew and relief party took to the floe, throwing overboard such stores and provisions as came to hand. Lieutenant Caldwell was the last man to leave the ship. Garlington and his party of 15 men, 2 whaleboats, and provisions for 40 days reached Cape Sabine in safety. He now followed the Wilds-Garlington agreement, which said, should Proteus be lost, push a boat with party south to Yantic. Garlington's record left by him on Brevoort Island read in part: Depot landed 500 rations of bread, tea, and a lot of canned goods. Cache of 250 rations left by expedition of 1882, visited by me and found in good condition. English depot in damaged condition, not visited by me. Cache on Littleton Island, boat at Isabella, USS Yantic on her way to Littleton Island with orders not to enter ice. I will endeavor to communicate with these vessels at once. Everything in power of man will be done to rescue the Greely's brave men. It transpired, writes Greely, that there was no boat at Isabella, that Garlington's orders to replace damaged caches were imperative and disobeyed, that he had no knowledge that the Littleton cache was safe, that at Sabine he took every pound of food he could reach, though told that Greely was provisioned only to August 1883, and that after Colwell's skill had brought Garlington safe to the Yantic, he did not even ask Wild to go north and lay down food for Greely, otherwise doomed to starvation. On September 13, 1883, Garlington wrote from St. John's, Newfoundland, to the Chief Signal Officer, U.S. Army, Washington. It is my painful duty to report total failure of the expedition. The Proteus was crushed in pack in latitude 70 degrees 52 minutes, longitude 74 degrees 25 minutes, and sunk on the afternoon of the 23rd July. My party and crew all saved. Made my way across Smith Sound and along eastern shore of Cape York, thence across Melville Bay to Upernavik, arriving there on 24th of August. The Yantic reached Upernavik 2nd of September and left same day, bringing entire party here today. All well. To telegraphic inquiries from the signal office asking what stores had been left for Greely came answer: no stores landed before sinking of ship. About 500 rations from those saved cached at Cape Sabine, also large cache of clothing. By the time suitable vessels could be procured, filled, provisioned, etc., it would be too late in the season to accomplish anything this year. We leave to the imagination the alarm aroused by the sudden realization of what this failure meant to our fellow countrymen at Fort Conger. From July 1882 to August 1883, not less than 50,000 rations were taken in the steamers Neptune, Yantic, and Proteus up to or beyond Littleton Island, and of that number about 1,000 were left in that vicinity, the remainder being returned to the United States or sunk with the Proteus. The date of Garlington's letter read September 13th. With what horror did it dawn upon the public mind that the abandonment of the well-supplied station at Fort Conger was ordered not later than September 1st. Even now, Greeley and his men, leaving behind them a scant year's army rations and carrying with them every pound of food possible, were making their hazardous retreat in heavily laden boats through waterways crowded with ice, acted on by strong currents and high winds, the recurring heavy gales keeping the pack in constant motion to and fro against the precipitous and rock-bound coast. Time and again, writes Greeley, only the most desperate efforts and measures secured the safety of the specially strengthened launch, while the whaleboat escaped destruction only by speedy unloading and drawing up on floes. Every cache, however small, was taken up, ending with damaged, moldy bread, etc. at Cape Hawks. End of Chapter 19, Part 1. Chapter 19, Part 2 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 19, Part 2. International Circumpolar Stations. Fort Conger had been abandoned August 9, 1883. On September 13th, the whaleboat had been left behind, afterward recovered, and the men were fighting their desperate way across the pack to the shore. The following day, Greeley made this entry in his journal. The absence of sufficient light to cast a shadow has had very unfortunate results, as several of the men in the past few days have been sadly bruised or strained. When no shadows form and the light is feeble and blended, there is the same uncertainty about one's walk as if the deepest darkness prevailed. The most careful observation fails to advise you as to whether the next step is to be on a level, up an incline, or over a precipice. These conditions are perhaps the most trying to Sergeant Brainerd, who, being in advance selecting our road, finds it necessary to travel as rapidly as possible. A few bad falls quite demoralize a man and make him more than ever doubtful of his senses. Traveling slowly with our heavily laden sledges, we rarely suffer much from this trouble, as our steps are slow and uncertain at the best. But when a jar does come on a man pulling his best, it gives his system a great shock and strain. On September 17th, all articles that were not of vital importance were abandoned, and yet the men were hauling about 6,000 pounds. At the end of a weary day, Sergeant Brainerd wrote in his journal, "Turned in at 11 p.m. after 10 hours of the severest physical strain. As the sleeping bags of those of us in the teepee are protected from the ice by only one thickness of canvas, our comfort can be imagined." 3 days later he adds, "We are now carrying burdens which would crush ordinary men, but the texture of the party is of the right sort, and adversity will have very little effect upon our spirits." On September 29, 1883, Greeley made a landing at a point midway between Cape Sabine and Isabella, after 51 days of the most arduous travel. The retreat from Conger to Cape Sabine, writes Greeley, involved over 400 miles travel by boats, and fully 100 with sledge and boat, the greater part of which was made under circumstances of such great peril or imminence of danger as to test to the utmost the courage, coolness, and endurance of any party and the capacity of any commander. As to my officers and men, it is but scant justice to say that they faced resolutely every danger, endured cheerfully every hardship, and were fully equal to every emergency, and they were many, of our eventful retreat. On October 5th, Lieutenant Lockwood says, "We have now 3 chances for our lives. First, finding American cash sufficient at Sabine or at Isabella. Second, by crossing the straits when our present rations are gone. Third, of shooting sufficient seal and walrus nearby here to last during the winter. Our situation is certainly alarming in the extreme." These men were shelterless, with but a small food supply, with impassable barriers of ice north and south. Some hunted on land, others on ice. Some put up stone huts, others searched for cairns and records. The Arctic night had settled upon them before their huts were barely finished. These huts of heavy granite stones, dug from the snow and ice, lifted with swollen and bleeding hands, put in place with back-breaking efforts by enfeebled, weary men, and into them they crawled with torn clothing, hand and foot gear in holes, covering shivering, aching bodies. In this desperate plight, scouts returned with news of the sinking of the Proteus and with the notice from Lieutenant Garlington describing the disaster, his plans and his retreat, and the caches of provisions at Cape Sabine, relying on the expressed promise that everything within the power of man will be done to rescue the brave men at Fort Conger from their perilous position. Greeley at once endeavored to move his party near that point. Camp Clay was established on Bedford Pim Island, which was reached October 15th, with 40 days' rations to tide over 250 days of darkness and misery until help could come. Another hut was erected by the same arduous methods employed in building former huts. The rock walls were about 2 feet thick and 3 feet high. Outside this wall was an embankment of snow, at first 4 feet thick, but as the season advanced, the winter gales buried the hut entirely in snow. The whaleboat just caught on the end walls, and under that boat was the only place in which a man could even get on his knees and hold himself erect. Sitting in our bags, the heads of the tall men touched the roof. "Compared to our previous quarters," writes Greeley, "the house is warm, but we are so huddled and crowded together that the confinement is almost intolerable. The men, though wretched from cold, hard work, and hunger, yet retain their spirits wonderfully." It now behooved the party to gather in the stores from all the caches, and this was done under the most trying conditions. The news of the loss of the Jeannette was learned by a newspaper found among the stores and brought in with other articles. Records and instruments of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition were safely cached early in October on Stolknecht Island. During the few remaining days of light, the hunter, along with the Eskimo, remained out of the floe in the intense cold, ill-fed, without shelter, for the purpose of securing seals or other game that might be seen. A seal was all that was secured under the most trying circumstances. When certain of the stores were examined to ascertain their condition, the dog biscuits were evidently bad, but when this bread, thoroughly rotten and covered with green mold, was thrown on the ground, the half-famished men sprang to it as wild animals would. October 26th, 1883, marked the last day of sunlight for 110 days. The hunters still pursued their labors, but without success. However, on the last day of the month, Bender was fortunate enough to kill a blue fox with his fist. It was caught with its head in a meat can. All rations had been collected except 144 pounds of beef cached by Norris in 1875, 40 miles distant at Cape Isabella. A further reduction of the quantity of food served to each man was inaugurated November 1st. The following day, Rice, Frederick, Ellison, and Lynn started in the Arctic night for Cape Isabella. On the 5th day out, they reached their destination after the most hazardous travel in temperatures ranging from -20 degrees to -25 degrees, with only 16 ounces of food per day to each man. Taking up their cache of meat, they started on their return journey. On reaching their first camp after 14 hours of hard travel, Ellison, who had done this day's work on a cup of tea and no food, was found to have frozen both his hands and feet. Our sleeping bag was no more nor less than a sheet of ice, writes Frederick in his journal. I placed one of Ellison's hands between my thighs, and Rice took the other, and in this way we drew the frost from his poor frozen limbs. This poor fellow cried all night from pain. This was one of the worst nights I ever spent in the Arctic. Continuing the next 2 days with their half-frozen comrade, they reached Eskimo Point. Here they cut up an abandoned iceboat for fuel and endeavored to thaw out Ellison's limbs and dry his clothing. When the poor fellow's face, feet, and hands commenced to thaw from the artificial heat, says Frederick, his sufferings were such that it was enough to bring the strongest to tears. After laboring 19 hours for the welfare of their suffering comrade, Rice and Frederick attempted to advance. We tried to keep Ellison in front of us, but to no avail. He would stagger off to one side, and it seemed every moment that the frost was striking deeper into the poor man's flesh. We fastened a rope to his arm and the sledge, as it now took 3 men to haul our load, but every few rods the poor fellow would fall, and then sometimes he was dragged several feet. No person can imagine how that poor man suffered. Unable to haul Ellison any farther in the face of a gale and the piercing temperature of -20 degrees, it was decided that Rice should start for Camp Clay for assistance. With only a bit of frozen meat for food, he started alone in the Arctic darkness and traveled 25 miles in 16 hours, reaching the camp at midnight. Immediate relief was started, Sergeant Brainerd and Christensen leading the advance, to be followed 2 hours later by Lieutenant Lockwood, the doctor, and 4 of the men. The fearful night spent by Frederick, Lynn, and their frozen companion can hardly be pictured. We tried to warm him, says Frederick, but as we lay helpless and shivering with the cold, and poor Ellison groaning with hunger, his frozen lips did not permit him to gnaw the frozen meat. And pain, you can imagine how we felt. Lynn was a strong, able-bodied man, but the mental strain caused by Ellison's sufferings made him weak and helpless. In fact, I was afraid that his mind would be impaired at one time. We were but a few hours in the bag when it became frozen so hard that we could not turn over, and we had to lay in one position 18 hours, until, to our great relief, we heard Brainerd's cheering voice at our side. There was nothing more welcome than the presence of that noble man, who had come in advance with brandy for Ellison and food for all. The rescue party, although weak and half-starved themselves, reached Ellison with all dispatch to find him in a very critical condition. His hands and feet were frozen solid, his face frozen to such an extent that there was little semblance of humanity. If November was ushered in with such misfortune, the succeeding months record a history of unparalleled misery and suffering. The hunters were ever on the alert, and the occasional game brought in was the only cheer that surrounded these famishing outcasts. A seal, a bear, a few foxes, dovekies, and ptarmigan were all that the desolate land gave forth to the unremitting vigilance of the hunters, and reduced to the last extremities of famine, shrimps, seaweed, reindeer moss, saxifrage, and lichens were diligently sought for and devoured. On Thanksgiving Day, what irony in the mere name, these men celebrated by a little extra allowance of food. And Greeley wrote in his journal, "Today we have been almost happy and had almost enough to eat." On December 9th, there is rejoicing because Brainerd and Long shot 2 blue foxes. "We are all very weak," writes Lieutenant Lockwood 10 days later, "and I feel an apathy and cloudiness impossible to shake off. It is a great difficulty to know each night just how much bread to save for breakfast on the morrow. Hunger tonight fights hunger tomorrow morning. I always eat my bread regretfully. If I eat it before tea, I regret that I did not keep it. And if I wait until tea comes and then eat it, I drink my tea hastily and do not get the satisfaction I otherwise would. What a miserable life when a few crumbs of bread weigh so on one's mind. It seems to be so with all the rest. All sorts of expedients are tried to cheat one's stomach, but with about the same result." On December 21st, Lieutenant Greeley says, "Sergeant Brainerd is 27 today. I gave him half a gill of rum extra on that account, regretting my inability to do more for him. He has worked exceedingly hard for us this winter, and while all have done their best, his endurance, unusual equanimity of temper, and impartial justice in connection with the food have been of invaluable service to me. Moldy hard bread and 2 cans of soup make a dinner for 12, says Brainerd. At Fort Conger, 10 cans of soup were needed to begin dinner. But even the dire calamity which now confronts us is insufficient to repress the great flow of good nature in our party generally. A terrible scene occurred in our wretched hut during the morning, writes Brainerd, March 24, 1884. While preparing breakfast, tea, the cooks had forgotten to remove the bundle of rags from the ventilators in the roof, and the fumes thrown off by the alcohol lamps, being confined to the small breathing space, soon produced asphyxia. Biederbick, one of the cooks, was the first to succumb to its effects, and Israel immediately afterwards became insensible. At the suggestion of Gardiner, all the rest of us rushed for the door, and the plugs were at once removed from the roof and the lamps extinguished. By prompt attention, Dr. Pavey succeeded in reviving Israel and Biederbick. Those who went outside were less fortunate than those who fainted in their bags. As soon as they came in contact with the pure outside air, all strength departed and they fell down on the snow in an unconscious state. In consequence of the absence of all animation, many of us were frostbitten, Lieutenant Greely and myself quite severely. The lives of several of the men were probably saved through the noble efforts of Gardiner, who, though weak and sick, did all in his power to get us in the hut. During the excitement of the hour, about half a pound of bacon was stolen from Lieutenant Greely's mess, and as soon as the fact became known, great indignation was expressed that in our midst lived a man with nature so vile and corrupt, so utterly devoid of all feelings of humanity, as to steal from his starving companions when they were thought to be dying. A deed so contemptible and heartless could not long remain concealed from those who had been injured. We were not disappointed in the discovery that Henry was the thief. He had literally bolted the bacon, and his stomach was overloaded to such a degree that in its enfeebled state it could not retain this unusual quantity of food, and his crime was thus detected. Jens afterwards reported having seen him commit the theft, and illustrated by signs his manner of doing it. Poor suffering Ellison, he writes a few days later. This morning he turned to the doctor and said, "My toes are burning dreadfully, and the soles of my feet are itching in a very uncomfortable manner. Can you not do something to relieve this irritation?" He little dreams that he has neither toes nor feet, they having sloughed off in January. On March 21st, Greeley makes this entry: "A storm prevents hunting. It is surprising with what calmness we view death, which, strongly as we may hope, seems now inevitable." As the gaunt and ghostly form of death laid its fatal touch upon the weakest, one by one, a strong man stole food from comrades, and stole again, and justly forfeited his right to live. Then, one by one, they died. The Eskimo Christensen from exhaustion, and Lynn. He asked for water just before dying, and we had none to give. Then Rice sacrificed his life for others, dying in the arms of his comrade Frederick, near Baird Inlet, where he had gone in search of 100 pounds of English beef abandoned in November, that Ellison might be brought to camp alive. Then Lockwood died, and Jewell failed, and soon joined his sleeping comrades. And yet, in face of horror crowding upon horror, there is an entry. On Easter Sunday we heard on our roof a snowbird chirping loudly, the first harbinger of spring. In the meantime, the chief dependence of this rapidly diminishing party was derived from the gathering of shrimps or sea lice. The small crustacea were from 1/8 to 1/2 of an inch in length, consisting of about 4/5 shell and 1/5 meat, and about 700 of them were required to weigh an ounce. Dr. Pavey says, writes Brainerd in his journal, May 20th, 1884, that our food must be something more substantial than these shrimps, or none of us can live long. I caught 12 pounds of these animals today, and 1 pound of marine vegetation. Returned very much exhausted from this trip. Cannot last much longer. caterpillars are now quite numerous on the bare spots of Cemetery Bridge. He writes a day or two later, "Yesterday, Bender saw one of these animals crawling over a rock near the tent, and after watching it intently for a moment, he hastily transferred it to his mouth, remarking as he did so, 'This is too much meat to lose.'" On May 29th, there was a southeast gale and drifting snow. Brainerd and Long returned from their day's hunting with a few pounds of shrimps and a dovekie. On returning to the tent, writes Brainerd, Dr. Pavey and Laylor refused to admit me to their sleeping bag in which I occupied a place. Physically, I could not enforce my rights in this matter, my condition bordering on extreme exhaustion. And wishing to avoid any unpleasantness, I crawled into one of the abandoned bags lying outside as the only alternative. This bag was frozen and filled with snow. Can my sufferings be imagined? They certainly cannot be described. Suffering with rheumatism and smarting under the sense of wrong done me by my sleeping bag companions, mental agony was added to physical torture. Today I caught 6 pounds of shrimps. This evening, June 6th, dinner consisted of a stew composed of 2 boot soles, a handful of reindeer moss, and a few rock lichens. The small quantity of shrimps which I furnish daily are sufficient only for the morning meal. Wednesday, June 11th, 1884. Long returned at 1:30 a.m. from the open water, bringing with him 2 fine guillemots which he had killed. One of these was given to the general mess, and the other will be divided among those who are doing the heavy work for their weaker companions. This evening a great misfortune befell me. The spring tides have broken out the ice at the shrimping place, and my nets have been carried away and lost. My baits, poor and miserable as they were, are gone also. It is anything but pleasant to reflect that tomorrow morning we will have no breakfast except a cup of tea. It was quite late when I returned this evening from shrimping, and everybody had retired. I did not have the heart to awaken the poor fellows, but I let them sleep on quietly under the delusion that breakfast would await them at the usual hour in the morning. How I pity them! I made a flag, or distress signal, as it might be more properly termed, which I intend placing on the high rocky point just north of our tent, where it may be seen by any vessel passing Cape Sabine. 10 days later, the whistle of the Thetis, blown by Captain Schle's orders to recall his searching parties, fell lightly on the ears of the dying commander of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition. I feebly asked Brainerd and Long if they had strength to go out, writes Greeley, and they answered, as always, that they would do their best. From the cutter, as it entered the cove, Lieutenant Colwell, straining his eyes, recognized the familiar landmarks of the year before. There, on the top of the little ridge, 50 or 60 yards above the ice foot, was plainly outlined the figure of a man. Instantly, the coxswain caught up the boat hook and waved the flag. The man on the ridge had seen them, for he stooped, picked up a signal flag from the rock, and waved it in reply. Then he was seen coming slowly and cautiously down the steep, rocky slope. Twice he fell down before he reached the foot. As he approached, still walking feebly and with difficulty, Caldwell hailed him from the bow of the boat. "Who all are there left?" "7 left." As the cutter struck the ice, continues Schley, Caldwell jumped off and went up to him. He was a ghastly sight. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes wild, his hair and beard long and matted. His army blouse, covering several thicknesses of shirts and jackets, was ragged and dirty. He wore a little fur cap and rough moccasins of untanned leather tied around the leg. As he spoke, his utterance was thick and mumbling, and in his agitation his jaws worked in convulsive twitches. As the two met, the man, with a sudden impulse, took off his glove and shook Caldwell's hand. "Where are they?" asked Caldwell briefly. "In the tent," said the man, pointing over his shoulder. "Over the hill. The tent is down." "Is Mr. Greeley alive?" "Yes, Greeley's alive." "Any other officers?" "No." Then he repeated absently, "The tent is down." "Who are you?" "Long." Before this colloquy was over, Lowe and Norman had started up the hill. Hastily filling his pockets with bread and taking the 2 cans of pemmican, Caldwell told the coxswain to take Long into the cutter and started after the others with Ash. Reaching the crest of the ridge and looking southward, they saw spread out before them a desolate expanse of rocky ground, sloping gradually from a ridge on the east to the ice-covered shore, which at the west made in and formed a cove. Back of the level space was a range of hills rising up 800 feet, with a precipitous face broken in two by a gorge through which the wind was blowing furiously. On a little elevation directly in front was the tent. Hurrying on across the intervening hollow, Caldwell came up with Lowe and Norman just as they were greeting a soldierly-looking man who had come out of the tent. As Caldwell approached, Norman was saying to the man, "There is the lieutenant." And he added to Caldwell, "This is Sergeant Brainerd." Brainerd immediately drew himself up to the position of the soldier and was about to salute when Caldwell took his hand. At this moment there was a confused murmur within the tent, and a voice said, "Who's there?" Norman answered, "It's Norman who was in the Proteus." This was followed by cries of, "Oh, it's Norman," and a sound like a feeble cheer. Meanwhile, one of the relief party, who in his agitation and excitement was crying like a child, was down on his hands and knees, trying to roll away the stones that held down the flapping tent cloth. There was no entrance except under the flap opening, which was held down by stones. Caldwell called for a knife, cut a slit in the tent cover, and looked in. It was a sight of horror, continues Schley. On one side, close to the opening, with his head toward the outside, lay what was apparently a dead man. His jaw had dropped, his eyes were open but fixed and glassy. His limbs were motionless. On the opposite side was a poor fellow, alive, to be sure, but without hands or feet. and with a spoon tied to the stump of his right arm. 2 others, seated on the ground in the middle, had just got down a rubber bottle that hung on the tent pole and were pouring from it into a tin can. Directly opposite, on his hands and knees, was a dark man with a long matted beard in a dirty and tattered dressing gown, with a little red skull cap on his head and brilliant, staring eyes. As Caldwell appeared, he raised himself a little and put on a pair of eyeglasses. "Who are you?" asked Caldwell. The man made no answer, staring at him vacantly. "Who are you?" again. One of the men spoke up. "That's the Major, Major Greeley." Caldwell crawled in and took him by the hand, saying to him, "Greeley, is this you?" "Yes," said Greeley in a faint, broken voice, hesitating and shuffling with his words. "Yes, 7 of us left. Here we are, dying, like men. Did what I came to do, beat the best record." The scene, as Caldwell looked around, was one of misery and squalor. The rocky floor was covered with cast-off clothes, and among them were huddled together the sleeping bags in which the party had spent most of their time during the last few months. There was no food left in the tent but 2 or 3 cans of a thin, repulsive-looking jelly made by boiling strips cut from the sealskin clothing. The bottle on the tent pole still held a few teaspoonfuls of brandy, but it was their last, and they were sharing it as Caldwell entered. It was evident that most of them had not long to live. Caldwell immediately sent Chief Engineer Lowe back to the cutter to put off to the Bear with Long to report and to bring the surgeon with stimulants, while he fed the dying men with bits of the food he had with him. As their hunger returned, they cried piteously for more. Fearing too much at one time would injure them, Caldwell wisely dissuaded them, but when Greeley found that he was refused, he took a can of the boiled sealskin, which he had carefully husbanded, and which he said he had a right to eat, as it was his own. The weaker ones were like children, petulant, rambling, and fitful in their talk, absent, and sometimes a little incoherent. The Bear having by this time arrived, Sergeant Long was lifted from the cutter aboard, and there told his pitiful tale. All were dead except Greeley and 5 others, and they were on shore in sore distress. Sore distress. It had been a hard winter, and the wonder was how in God's name they had pulled through. "No words," says Schley, "can describe the pathos of this man's broken and enfeebled utterance, as he said over and over, 'A hard winter, a hard winter.'" And the officers who were gathered about him in the wardroom felt an emotion which most of them were at little pains to conceal. Soon after, the Thetis came in sight, and her officers, including brave Melville, whose last sad offices for De Long had been but lately finished, went ashore and aided those from the Bear in the care and succor of the forlorn party. As soon as possible, the men were carefully moved on stretchers and carried in boats to the ships, but not before a hurricane had broken upon them, which made the labor hazardous and difficult. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Emery of the Bear was making a careful collection of all the articles belonging to the camp. Near the sleeping bags were found little packages of cherished valuables, carefully rolled up and addressed to friends and relatives at home. The survivors too, had already done up and addressed their own, and, strange as it may seem, a pocketbook was found containing a large roll of bills carried by the owner for some unaccountable reason to the barren shores of Lady Franklin Bay. It was not difficult to move the bodies of the dead. There was only a thin covering of sand above the mounds that formed the graves. Looking out from the side of the hut to the ice foot, Caldwell's attention was fixed by a dark object on the snow. Following a path which led to it from where he stood, he found the mutilated remains of a man's body. It was afterward identified from a bullet hole, writes Schley, as that of Private Henry, who had been executed on the 6th of June. Wrapping it in a blanket, Caldwell carried it to the landing place, where a seaman took the bundle on his shoulder. Presently the boat came off, and all who had remained on shore were taken on board the Bear. The ships returned to Peary Harbor. The next day, June 23rd, Lieutenant Emery, accompanied by Seabree and Melville, and a number of men made a second search at Camp Clay, which lasted several hours. Everything was gathered up and brought away. The officers of the Thetis meanwhile had secured from Stalknecht Island Greely's tin boxes containing his scientific records and standard pendulum. The Relief Squadron in 1884, under Captain W. S. Schley and Commander W. H. Emery, and fitted out under the personal orders of the Honorable W. E. Chandler, Secretary of the Navy, had brilliantly executed its commission and had outrivaled the early Scotch whalers, to whom a bounty had been offered by Congress for the speedy rescue of Greely, in pushing boldly through the middle ice. No relief or expeditionary vessels ever ventured at so early a date into the dangers of Melville Bay, writes Greely. That the United States Navy won in the race for Sabine is an illustration of the wonderful adaptability and abundant resources of the representative American seaman, which so well fits him for coping successfully with new and untried dangers, and makes him a worthy rival of our kin across the sea. In triumph, they bore the remnant of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition home to relatives and friends. Only 6 reached America alive. Brave, pitiful Ellison had died at Godhaven, July 8th. 6 soldiers out of a company of 25, broken in health, yet courageous in spirit, and loyal to a nation that through a hard winter, in sore distress, had left them to their fate. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Katerina. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 20. Nansen, the man. First Arctic experience. Plans the crossing of Greenland. Carries out his great undertaking. Voyage on the Fram. Drifting with the current. Life aboard. Nansen and Johansen start for the pole. Difficulties of travel, the farthest north. The retreat. A winter on the Franz Josef Land. Attempt to reach Spitzbergen by kayak. The meeting at Cape Flora with Frederick Jackson. Home in the Windward. The character of the explorer Nansen is best summarized in the brief paragraph explaining his plan for the first crossing of Greenland. "My notion," he says, "was that if a party of good ski lobers were equipped in a practical and sensible way, they must get across Greenland if they began from the right side, this latter point being of extreme importance. For if they were to start, as all other expeditions have done, from the west side, they were practically certain never to get across. They would have the same journey back again in order to reach home. So it struck me that the only sure road to success was to force a passage through the floe belt, land on the desolate and icebound east coast, and thence cross over to the inhabited west coast. In this way one would burn all one's ships behind one. There would be no need to urge one's men on, as the east coast would attract no one back, while in front would lie the west coast with all the allurements and amenities of civilization. There was no choice of route forward being the only word. The order would be death or the west coast of Greenland." Between these lines one sees the fiber of this man, who deliberately stakes out his course and invites a race with death to the goal of victory, who carefully curtails to the minimum the possibility of failure, who thoughtfully removes from weaker companions all temptations that might jeopardize his chances of success, and who carries through a plan scoffed at by the world as the impracticable scheme of a madman. There is an indescribable charm about this bold Norwegian, who was a terrible one for falling into brown studies as a child, of whom his masters wrote. He is unstable, and in several subjects his progress is not nearly so satisfactory as might have been expected. Who combines a gentle, childlike disposition with an indomitable will, never doubting for an instant that he is right and the world wrong, and who steadfastly goes to work to prove his point. Born in 1861 near Christiana, educated in the university of his native city, fond of all the sciences, trained as a zoologist, a natural athlete, an expert ski lober, a good hunter with a spirit for adventure which is totally careless of all creature comforts, Fridtjof Nansen at 21 stood on the prow of the Viking, a Norwegian sealer bound for the Arctic seas, ready to meet a foe worthy of his mettle. This trip to East Greenland waters for the purpose of gathering zoological specimens was followed by his appointment the same year as curator in the Natural History Museum at Bergen. The return of the Nordenskjöld in 1883 from his second remarkable journey to Greenland determined Nansen upon a similar journey, the success of which he carefully planned. Nordenskjöld had made 15 marches on the inland ice from Sofia harbor south to Disco Bay, and reached an altitude of 4,900 feet, sending skilled Lapps on skis a farther distance of 140 miles, where they reached an elevation of 6,600 feet on the marvelous ice cap which still rose before them. Accompanied by 3 Norwegians, Otto Sverdrup, Lieutenant Olaf Christian Dietrichson of the Norwegian Army, and Christian Trana, and 2 Lapps, Balto and Ravna, Nansen sailed on the Danish steamer Thyra from Scotland, May 9, 1888. The Thyra was to carry the little band of explorers the first stage of their journey to Iceland. At Faroe Islands, Nansen learned of the extremely bad condition of the ice round Iceland. The east coast of the island was reported inaccessible. By May 17, the Thyra stood off the Westmanna Islands, and later she passed Reykjanes, which carries the only lighthouse Iceland possesses. Anchoring off Þingeyri, the party took leave of the Thyra, and, warmly welcomed by Herr Graham, the merchant of Þingeyri, they evaded the Jason, which was to convey them to the coast of Greenland. On the morning of June 3rd, the expectant party sighted a little steamer slowly working inwards. As she came nearer, she was found to be the Isefold of the Norwegian Whaling Company. She anchored and sent a boat on shore, amid increasing excitement. "I had begun to suspect the truth," says Nansen, "when, to my astonishment as well as joy, I recognized in the first man who stepped ashore Captain Jacobsen of the Jason. Our meeting was almost frantic, but the story was soon told. He had reached Isefjord, and, not finding us there, had thought of coming on to Durafjord with the Jason. But with the strong wind blowing, it would have taken his heavily rigged ship a whole day to make the voyage, and, as the Norwegian company's manager most kindly offered to send the Isefold to fetch us, he had taken the opportunity of coming too." Farewells were hastily said. Willing hands transferred the baggage, which consisted, in addition to the usual alpine outfit, of Canadian and Norwegian snowshoes, instruments, food, fuel, and sleeping gear, a load of 1,200 pounds for their 5 sledges, and a restive and unwilling pony bought of Herr Graham in the icefall steamed out of the fjord and to the northwards. For 6 weeks the Jason made fruitless attempts to land the impatient explorers on this barren coast of Greenland, when July 17, 1888, Nansen and his party attempted by boat to make Cape Dan, from which they were separated by an ice stream 10 miles wide. When Ravna saw the ship for the last time, writes Balto the Lab, he said to me, "What fools we were to leave her to die in this place. There is no hope of life. The great sea will be our graves." Sleeping upon the floes at night, dragging or rowing their boats by day, the journey to the coast was perilous and dangerous in the extreme. After several days they found themselves being carried south upon the floe, and, straight away from shore at a pace that rendered all resistance completely futile. July 20th, says Nansen, "I was roused by some violent shocks to the floe on which we were encamped, and thought the motion of the sea must have increased very considerably. When we get outside, we discover that the floe has split in two not far from the tent. The Labs, who had at once made for the highest points of our piece of ice, now shout that they can see the open sea. The swell is growing heavier and heavier, and the water breaking over our floe with ever-increasing force. The blocks of ice and slush, which come from the grinding of the floes together and are thrown up round the edges of our piece, do a good deal to break the violence of the waves. The worst of it is that we are being carried seawards with ominous rapidity." Taking refuge upon a stronger and larger floe, the party evaded the issue with courage and resignation, though it must be confessed the poor Labs were not in the best of spirits. They had given up hope of life and were making ready for death. A night of fearful promise succeeded a day of imminent peril. Sverdrup took the watch and paced alone the sea-washed floe. Several times he had stood by the tent door prepared to turn his comrades out. Once he actually undid one hood, says Nansen, took another turn to the boats, and then another look at the surf, leaving the hood unfastened in case of accidents. A huge crack of ice was swaying in the sea close beside us, and threatening every moment to fall upon our floe. The surf was washing us on all sides. The other boat, in which Balto was asleep, was washed so heavily that again and again Sverdrup had to hold it in its place. A second time he came to undo the tent hood, but just as things looked their worst, the floe changed her course, and as if directed by an unseen hand sailed toward land, and took refuge in a good harbor. On July 29th, the fates were kind, and they made a landing at Anoritok, 62 degrees 5 minutes north, nearly 200 miles south of Cape Dan. Following the shore to the north, they fell in with natives near Cape Bill. The ice journey commenced from Ninivik, 64 degrees 45 minutes north, which was reached August 10, after pursuing their journey up steep, irregular slopes, covered with soft snow and beset with dangerous crevasses. They made only 40 miles inland after 17 days of most arduous travel, and reached an elevation of 6,000 feet. It was now late in the year, writes Nansen, and the autumn of the inland ice was not likely to prove a gentle season, so the fact that it was considerably shorter crossing to the head of one of the fjords in the neighborhood of Gudthap to Christianshavn was an argument that had its weight. I consulted the map again and again, made the calculations to myself, and finally determined upon the Gudthap route. The point where I thought of getting down was that which we actually hit, and which lies at about latitude 64 degrees 10 minutes north. The rest of the party hailed my change of plan with acclamation. They seemed to have already had more than enough of inland ice, were longing for kindlier scenes, and gave their unqualified approval to the new route. Sails had been rigged to the sleds, and with the terrific winds which swept the ice cap, advance was assisted by this means, the men marching on skis. So frightful were the storms that raged over these desolate snowfields that at night it seemed as if the tent would be torn to shreds, and before a start could be made in the morning, the sledges had to be dug out of the drifts and unloaded so that their runners might be scraped clean of snow and ice, a task which we found anything but graceful in the biting wind. But the cruelest work of the whole day was getting the tent up in the evening, for we had to begin by lacing the floor and walls together. As this had to be done with the unprotected fingers, we had to take good care not to get them seriously frozen. One evening when I was at work, says Nansen, I suddenly discovered that the fingers of both my hands were white up to the palms. I felt them and found they were as hard and senseless as wood. By rubbing and beating them, however, I soon set the blood in circulation and brought their color back. The labs suffered from snow blindness, and all were burned by the sun's rays. This was largely due to the want of density in the air and the reflection of the rays from the level expanse of snow. About 10 in the morning of August 31st, writes Dietrichson, we saw land for the first time. We were upon the crest of one of the great waves, or gentle undulations in the surface, and had our final glimpse of a little point of rock which protruded from the snow. It lay, of course, far in the interior, and for many days had been the only dark point save ourselves and the sledges on which our eyes could rest. At an altitude of nearly 8,000 feet, they toiled on for days over the interminable desert of snow. There was no break in the horizon, no object to rest the eye upon, and a course was laid out by the diligent use of the compass alone. From the second week in September, the party had been anxiously looking for the beginning of the western slope. On September 19th, Balto's joyful cry of "Land ahead!" greeted the advancing sledge fleet. The ice conditions had become more formidable in character, the gradual descent treacherous in the extreme. It was a curious sight for me to see the two vessels coming rushing along behind me, says Nansen, with their square Viking-like sails showing dark against the white snowfields and the big round disk of the moon behind. Faster and faster I go flying on, while the ice gets more and more difficult. There's worse still ahead, I can see, and in another moment I am into it. The ground is here seamed with crevasses, but they are full of snow and not dangerous. Every now and then I feel my staff go through into space, but the cracks are narrow and the sledges glide easily over. Presently I cross a broader one and see just in front of me a huge black abyss. I creep cautiously to its edge on the slippery ice, which here is covered by scarcely any snow, and look down into the deep, dark chasm. Beyond it I can see crevasse after crevasse, running parallel with one another and showing dark blue in the moonlight. I now tell the others to stop, as this is no ground to traverse in the dark, and we must halt for the night. The joy of having crossed the ice cap and the prospect of successfully passing the inland ice to the more congenial soil of the western coast caused the little band to meet cheerfully the most arduous labor in a perilous descent over crevasses and glacier, mountain and valley into the promised land, of which old Ravna spoke with enthusiasm. I like the west coast well. It is a good place for an old lab to live in. There are plenty of reindeer. It is just like the mountains of Finnmarken. Having reached the coast, it became essential to reach civilization as well, and to expedite the journey it was found desirable to go by sea. The lack of a boat was a small consideration to men who had boldly sailed sledges across the Greenland ice cap. For though wood, tools, and materials were lacking, there was the tent and plenty of willow bushes around, some 6 or 7 feet in height. Ribs made of these would not be as straight as we could wish, says Nansen, and would not stretch the canvas very evenly, but the main thing was to get her to carry us. By the evening the boat was finished. She was no boat for a prize competition. Indeed, in shape she was more like a tortoiseshell than anything else. In this crazy little craft Nansen and Sverdrup rowed away to get relief from the inhabitants of Godthab. Their companions remained in Amaralik Fjord in charge of the sledges and equipment. Great was the rejoicing in Godthab when the explorers reached there, and immediate preparations were made to succor the remainder of the party. These had slowly moved in the direction of Godthab and gratefully welcomed the Eskimos who met them with supplies. Unfortunately, the party missed the last European vessel that left port that season and were obliged to spend the winter in Greenland. Letters and dispatches, however, had been carried by the Eskimos down the coast to the Fox, McClintock's old vessel, in his famous search for Sir John Franklin, and this veteran little craft carried the thrilling news of the first crossing of Greenland to Europe. The winter passed, and on April 15th, the settlement rang with a single shriek. "The ship! The ship!" Joyfully the brave band of explorers received news from home, and almost sorrowfully prepared to leave their hospitable friends of Godthab. On May 21st, 1889, Nansen and his companions made their triumphant entry into Copenhagen, and, concludes Nansen, May 30th we entered Christiania Fjord and were received by hundreds of sailing boats and a whole fleet of steamers. When we got near the harbor and saw the ramparts of the old fortress and the quays on all sides black with people, Dietrichson said to Ravna, "Are not all these people a fine sight, Ravna?" "Yes, it is fine, very fine. But if they had only been reindeer," was Ravna's answer. Previous to his famous journey across Greenland, in one of his many conferences with Dr. H. Rink, that veteran explorer of Greenland, Nansen was addressed by Mrs. Rink, who said to him, "You must go to the North Pole, too, some day," and without hesitation he answered her emphatically, as though his mind had long ago been made up on that point, "I mean to." From his 23rd year, Nansen had bent his mind and energies upon that great journey into the polar regions, upon which he did not embark, however, until 9 years later. In the meantime, he was appointed curator in the Museum of Comparative Anatomy at Christiania University. In the Danish Geographical Journal for 1885, Mr. Lützen, colonial manager at Julianshaab, gave an interesting account of certain relics of the ill-fated Jeannette expedition picked up by Eskimos on the West Greenland coast. Among these articles was a list of provisions, signed by Captain DeLong, a manuscript list of the Jeannette's boats, a pair of oilskin breeches marked Louis Noros, the name of a member of the Jeannette's crew, the peak of a cap with F.C. Lindeman or Nindeman written on it. It was plain to Dr. Nansen that these articles had drifted no less than 2,900 miles, and in a period of 1,100 days. Nor could he escape the conviction that a current passes across or very near the pole into the sea between Greenland and Spitzbergen. Upon this hypothesis, Dr. Nansen urged his plan to take a well-provisioned ship, built on such principles as to enable it to withstand the pressure of ice, for on the same drift ice and by the same route it must be no less possible to transport an expedition. In spite of the madness of his scheme, its condemnation by many of the most eminent Arctic authorities of Europe and America, the Norwegian government extended its patronage, and the Storthing granted 11,250 pounds toward the expenses of the expedition, the remainder being collected by private subscription. The Fram, 800 tons displacement, was built with especial attention to the construction of the shape of the hull, so as to offer the greatest possible resistance to the attacks of the ice. She carried requisite provisions for dogs and men for 5 years, and coal for 4 months steaming at full speed. The Fram left Norway in June 1893, skirted the north coasts of Europe and Asia, and put into the polar pack ice near the New Siberia Island, September 22, 1893. Frozen fast in the ice 3 days later, the Fram stood off northwest of Sonnekoff Land in 78 degrees 50 minutes north, 134 degrees east. It now behooved the company to ship rudder, clean the boilers, and prepare for winter. No idle moments could be spared. Rigging must be cared for, sails inspected, provisions of all kinds got out from the cases down in the hold and handed over to the cook, and the smithy called upon for his offices in repairing bear traps, hooks, knives, etc. A busy life is a happy one, and the Fram's company lived in harmonious good fellowship and drifted leisurely with the great ice pack, just as Nansen had predicted they would, with only occasional visits from bears to break the monotony of complete isolation. In December, Nansen, who had read Dr. Kane's fearful experiences in the Arctic night, with insufficient food for dogs and men, suffering from the ravages of scurvy, compares his own condition in the comfortable warm quarters on board the Fram. No aging or depressing effects had been felt by any member of his party. The quiet, regular life seemed to agree with them, and with good food in profusion and variety, a warm shelter, plenty of exercise in the open air, and cheerful diversions in the shape of instructive books and amusing games, the men kept up a cheerful balance of good health and spirits. Nevertheless, the patience of all on board was sorely tried before the cruise was over. The drift of the ship during the 35 months of her besetment was uneven and irregular. Her zigzag course as she receded or approached her goal encouraged or disheartened her enthusiastic crew. She met bravely and withstood in a remarkable manner threatened disaster from the ice pressures. Wild enthusiasm greeted the slightest advance, such as was found February 16, 1894, when the observations showed 80 degrees 1 minute north latitude, a few minutes north of the observations taken the week before. And a corresponding depression is noticed when contrary winds retard or actually force the Fram to retrace her hard-earned progress. It is not surprising that Nansen's adventurous spirit grew restive under the enforced inactivity of the Fram's uncertain drift. Early in the year 1894, one finds his mind working upon the deep-laid plans to force the issue with the enemy, and eventually he announced his intentions of attempting one of the most daring and hazardous sledge journeys in the annals of Arctic adventure. His plan was to leave the ship with one companion, advance over the frozen polar ocean as far as possible, and without making an effort to rejoin the ship, retreat by way of Franz Josef Land and Spitsbergen back to Norway. February 26, 1895, he officially informed the crew that after his departure, Captain Sverdrup was to be chief officer of the expedition, with Lieutenant Scott Hansen second in command. On the 14th of March, 1895, the Fram stood in 84 degrees 4 minutes north, 102 degrees east, and amid a parting salute with flag, pennant, and guns, Nansen's third and final sledge dash to the north was taken. Johannessen, who had been chosen as his companion for this arduous undertaking, was in all respects qualified for the work, an accomplished snowshoer equaled by few in his powers of endurance, a fine fellow physically and mentally. Off they went, accompanied for a short distance by several of the crew. 3 sledges drawn by 28 dogs were loaded with 2 kayaks and provisions for 100 days for the men and 50 days dog food. Nansen and Johannessen, fully confident that 50 days would see them at the pole, plunged into the unknown and met bravely the pitiless foe. Hummocks and ridges, lanes and slush, cold and exhaustion, these were the impediments to progress. It was Nansen's rule to march 9 or 10 hours, broken by a midday halt for a little rest and a bit to eat. These stops were a bitter trial to the men exposed to the merciless winds without fire or shelter, to be followed by the uncomfortable task of disentangling the dogs' traces before they were able to take up the march again. On March 29th, they were grinding on, but very slowly. The dogs were showing signs of weakening. There was endless disentangling of the hauling ropes. On April 3rd, they were making the desperate way over ridges and lanes which had frozen together with rubble on either side. It was impossible to use snowshoes, there being too little snow between the hummocks. Thick weather, with deceptive mists making all things white, added to their miseries. Irregularities and holes in the spaces between, so that the men and dogs stumbled blindly on, crashing into pitfalls and cracks and running the grave risk of broken bones. On April 6, the ice grew worse and worse. After an advance of only 4 miles, Nansen and Johannessen were in despair. The following day, the limit of patience was reached. A world's record made. Nansen found himself in 86 degrees 13.6 minutes north, about 95 degrees east longitude, a distance of 121 geographical miles from the Fram, with 235 miles between himself and the pole. 23 days had passed. Nansen and Johannessen turned their backs upon a veritable chaos of ice blocks, stretching as far as the horizon, and prepared for their retreat to Cape Fligely. On this remarkable journey southward, confidently expected by Nansen to extend over not more than 3 months, but which in reality lengthened to 153 days, the courage and ability of these men was tested to the utmost. Frightful gales which disrupted the pack, and thick fogs which made advance almost impossible, added to their discomforts and privations. The dogs, reduced in strength from exhaustion and lack of food, died one by one, overkilled and fed to the survivors. The work of hauling became heavier and heavier as their numbers diminished. The men had the misfortune to allow their watches to run down, thereby making their longitude observations uncertain, the result of which was that they traveled far out of their course in search of the land which persistently remained hidden. Early in June it became necessary to curtail the rations, and although they steadfastly kept to weights in order that their remaining provisions would last, they were reduced June 18 to a frugal supper of 2 ounces aluronic bread and 1 ounce butter per man, and crept into their sleeping bags hungry and exhausted. The capture of a seal relieved a situation that threatened to become very serious. At last, on July 24th, the tired eyes of the travelers rested upon something rising above the never-ending white line of the horizon, and the joyful cry was raised of, "Land! Land!" Progress to the happy hunting ground was exasperatingly slow and not without its startling adventures. Johannessen was attacked by a bear, and without the prompt action on the part of Nansen would doubtless have proved its victim. Open water was reached August 6, 1895. and by dint of paddling and hauling up on the floes to advance by sledge, on August 16th they stood on the dry land of Huon Island. Continuing on their journey, they soon realized that the rapid approach of winter would make the effort to reach Spitzbergen impossible, so they encamped on one of the outlying islands off Franz Josef Land, and building themselves a stone hut covered with walrus hides, prepared to spend the winter. Bears and walrus were plentiful and supplied them with abundant food. Other game was occasionally shot. The cold Arctic night found them, on the whole, quite comfortable in their hut. The train oil lamps kept the temperature in the middle of the room about freezing. For 9 months Nansen and Johannessen hibernated thus, with no variation to their existence but the taking of the most necessary meteorological observations. With the return of spring, the two wild men made every preparation for their journey to Spitzbergen. This was no easy matter, considering they lacked everything, and the few reserve stores of flour and chocolate had mildewed and spoiled during the winter. On May 19, 1896, the sledges stood loaded and lashed, and after leaving inside the hut a short report of their journey and adventures, Nansen and Johannessen started for Spitzbergen. Though the winter had been long and monotonous, adventure greeted them frequently in their advance. Nansen nearly lost his life by falling into a waterhole. They were delayed by a gale, during which they nearly lost their kayaks. Seeing these frail crafts, with all they possessed on board, drifting rapidly away from their moorings, Nansen sprang into the icy water and made a desperate attempt at rescue. Meanwhile, Johannessen paced restlessly up and down the ice in an agony of suspense. With strokes growing more and more feeble, the swimmer realized the desperate situation and, putting forth his last benumbed energies in a final stroke, grasped a snowshoe which lay across the end. All but frozen, Nansen had great difficulty in getting into the kayak, and still more trouble in paddling to land. Numb and shivering, the wind biting his very marrow, he yet had courage to fire at 2 auks, which he secured for a warm and welcome supper. In the meantime, their meat was nearly gone. The outlook was anything but promising. In these frail, weather-worn, canvas-covered kayaks, 12 feet long, about 2.5 feet wide, and hardly more than 1 1/4 feet deep, there was yet a journey of 200 miles of ocean, more or less encumbered by ice, which intervened between them and Spitzbergen, where their only hope lay in being taken aboard one of the small vessels which visit these shores every summer. The future for Nansen and Johannessen was indeed desperate, but a happy chance brought them timely deliverance, and the dramatic meeting with Frederick G. Jackson, June 17, 1896, in the isolated regions of Franz Josef Land, terminated one of the most brilliant retreats in Arctic history. Mr. Jackson and his companions, who for 2 years had been making most valuable scientific observations and collecting specimens in all departments of natural science which the islands and surrounding seas afforded, welcomed the wanderers with open arms, brought them to the house, fed and warmed them, and, best of all, gave them news from home and letters. It was not surprising that the first night was spent in reading home letters which Jackson had faithfully carried for them into these desolate regions, and in talking over the strange adventures now so happily ended. For at last their work was done, and, as Nansen said, he didn't want to sleep, he felt so happy. So the days passed rapidly until the Windward came, which brought yearly supplies to Jackson and carried home the adventurous explorers. They reached Bardo Haven August 13. All that was needed to complete the happiness of the homecoming was news of the Fram, and this was not long withheld. On August 20th, 1896, the joyful tidings of the arrival of the Fram reached Nansen in a brief telegram sent from Skjervo, Kvænangen Fjord. She had pursued her monotonous drift to her highest point to the west-northwest, 85 degrees 57 minutes north, 60 degrees east, changing to a south-southeast direction to 84 degrees 9 minutes north, 15 degrees east, where she remained nearly stationary from February until June 1896. The open summer permitted Captain Sverdrup to push through her ice barrier and, by the judicious use of explosives, blast her way to the open water August 13, 1896, north of Spitzbergen. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Andrew Wade. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 21. Journeys of Dr. A. Bunge and Baron E. von Toll. Exploration in Spitzbergen. Sir Martin Conway, Dr. A. G. Nathorst, Professor J. H. Gore, Andre's balloon expedition to the North Pole. Search for Andre by Theodore Lerner. J. Stradling, Dr. A. G. Nathorst. Captain Bade. Walter Wellman's plan to reach the pole from Spitzbergen. Italian expedition under Duke of Abruzzi. The loss of Stellar Polar. Captain Umberto Cagni's journey. Breaks the record. Retreat. Home. Baldwin Ziegler expedition of 1900. Complete equipment. Return of expedition in autumn. Ziegler expedition under Anthony Fiala. The America reaches high northing. Winters in Triplets Bay. Is destroyed. Failure of sledge journeys. Relief ship does not come. Second winter. Return of party by Terra Nova in 1903. The voyage of Jeannette, among other valuable scientific results, had proven Wrangel Land to be an island of moderate size. The drift of the Fram had demonstrated the theory of a polar ocean of vast dimensions and great depth. The interest, therefore, in Arctic exploration for the next few years was centered in numerous scientific parties, which thoroughly examined, surveyed, and explored the unknown sections of lands bordering on the polar basin. As early as 1885, an expedition was fitted out under the auspices of the Imperial Russian Geographical Society and placed in charge of Dr. A. Bunge and Baron E. von Toll for scientific and geographical work in the Siberian island. Toll visited Nova Sibir and traversed the entire coast of Illinois. In the meantime, Dr. Bunge explored Great Lykoff, where he secured a valuable collection of fossils. Toll returned again to the Arctic in 1893, visiting the northeast of Jana for the purpose of securing a well-preserved mammoth. Afterward, in company with Lieutenant Shaliko, he visited the New Siberian island with dog sledges, traveled on the west coast of Illinois as far as 75 degrees 37 minutes north latitude, establishing 2 depots of provisions for Nansen's possible use. Among other important results of this expedition was the discovery of evidence that in the mammoth periods trees grew no less than 3 degrees north of their present limit. Toll returned to the mainland and followed the Lena, reporting impassable tundras from Sviatoy Nos to Dudinka, and reached Yeniseisk the 4th of December. Later geographical researches were made on the Great Lykoff Island. Baron Toll determined upon another voyage to the Arctic for the purpose of supplementing the geographical knowledge of Bennett and other islands, and to complete a journey of exploration to Sanikoff Land, first seen by him in 1886. The Saria was fitted out for this expedition, and the winter of 1900 to 1901 passed in 76 degrees 8 minutes north latitude and 95 degrees east longitude. On April 18, 1901, writes von Toll, immediately after the Feast of Easter, Lieutenant Kolomizov and the zoologist A. Borelja set out with 2 sleighs, each with a team of 8 dogs, the object of the first being to reach the Yenisei and establish coaling stations, while the second was directed to accompany it as far as Cape Sterlegoff, some 200 wersts distant. 2 days later began my excursion with Lieutenant Koltschak to the Chelyuskin Peninsula, accompanied by a sleigh with a team of 12 dogs and laden as lightly as possible. On May 1st, we reached that point on the bay where we had established a depot the previous year, 1900. The provisions and fish here buried were to complete our supplies, which barely sufficed just 1 month, but we were unable to dig out the deposit from the deep snow. On May 7th, we started from this place in an east-northern easterly direction, with the intention of pushing it on to St. Thaddeus Bay on the east coast of the Chelyuskin Peninsula, and returning thence along the coast. After traversing the tundra for 40 wersts in this direction, we again came unexpectedly on an inlet, which grew narrower towards the west-southwest, where it assumed the form of a narrow sound or river mouth. The position was determined by Lieutenant Koltschak. Off the side of the bay was 76 degrees 17 minutes north and 90 degrees 29 degrees east. On May 12th, the tired dogs were given a day's rest. Then Toll made a day's march half a degree eastward on Canadian snowshoes. There were no prospects for adding to their limited food supply by hunting, so it became necessary to retrace their steps. Hitherto, writes Toll, we had contended with almost constant difficulties caused by fog and deep snow, already softened by the sun, but henceforth we had to struggle with the contrary snowstorms, which lasted almost without break for 14 days. The consequence was the loss of 5 dogs, which broke down one after another through exhaustion. On May 30th, we reached the Saria, the excursion having lasted 41 days. Of these, we had to pass 9 in sleeping sack during the fiercest snowstorms. 4 were uselessly wasted at the depot, and during the remaining 28 days, we covered 500 worths. Other excursions were made by members of the party with more gratifying results. The release of the Saria was confidently hoped for early in August, but in the interim, writes Baron Toll, there was still to be solved a geographical question, namely to discover the mouth of the Tamir River. According to the maps hitherto published, the Tamir was supposed to discharge in the first or second of the larger bights lying to the east of the Tamir Sound. Both of these were twice explored by Lieutenant Kolsmioff, and in the first was in fact found the mouth of a considerable stream. But its configuration was not all in accordance with the contour lines given by the topographer Wagenoff on Middendorf's chart. In the second, no indication could be detected of any river mouth. As these researches had been undertaken in winter amid fogs and snowdrifts, there still remained a doubt, which could only be removed by fresh investigations carried out in the clear summer weather. Should these also lead to negative results, the only remaining assumption should be that the Tamar discharged into that bight which, during the journey to the interior of the Chelyuskin Peninsula, Lieutenant Kolchak and I had crossed, since no considerable stream assuredly entered the other inlet where the depot lay. The survey of the first 2 bays was undertaken by Borelja and Dr. Walter, their excursion lasting from July 20 to August 15, 1901. Respecting the question of the Tamir, the 2 savants came to negative results. Still, they confirmed Kolsmioff's discovery of large estuary in the first of the 2 bays. On the 25th of August, the fissures in the ice had expanded. The whole of the ice pack round the Saharia set in motion, and she drifted in the direction of the cliffs of Station Island. Slowly she was carried through the Fram Strait to the open sea. Withdrawing behind a cape at Nansen Island, the Saharia waited the drifting away of the ice pack. On August 30, the waterway was free, and she began her voyage to Kolt Etnoy Island. Doubling Cape Chelyuskin on September 1, she sighted 3 days later the east coast of Tamir Peninsula without meeting any ice. As we draw near, writes Toll, to the New Siberian Archipelago, in favorable weather till September 7th, a strong southeaster began to blow in our teeth, and against this we made very slow headway. I therefore changed the course to the northeast. On September 9th, we reached the edge of the ice pack in 79 degrees 9 minutes north and 14 degrees east. Here we encountered a southern gale, which, acting in concert with the marine current, drove the Saharia 30 miles to the northwest. The storm veered around the west-southwest, and I thought it better again to make the most of the wind and now direct our course southeastwards for Bennet Island, instead of trying, under these circumstances, to penetrate into the ice in search of land. On September 11th, the imposing headland of Cape Emma at Bennet Island suddenly loomed up before us out of the fog, and presently again wrapped in fog. We had approached to within 12 knots of the island, when our further advance towards it was barred by a belt of 14 feet thick of impenetrable ice. Here we remained 2 days in hope that the ice might shift, but in vain. Disappointed in his hopes for reaching Sanikoff Island in 1902, Baron Toll succeeded in sheltering the Saharia for a second winter at Nerpichi Bay, Kot Elnoy Island, 75 degrees, 22 minutes north, 137 degrees, 16 minutes east. The sad disaster which overtook the brave scientist ends a chapter valuable to Arctic achievement. On June 7, 1902, Baron Toll, accompanied by Seeberg, the astronomer, and 2 hunters, left for a geological excursion, and after arduous efforts landed on Bennet Island August 3rd, which was found to be a plateau some 1,500 feet in height. Their researches disclosed Cambrian deposits. They left the island to return to the ship on November 8, 1902, and were never seen again. Brunsniff and Koltzak, in relief expedition in 1904, discovered a record containing the information just stated, but no other traces were found of these courageous men who sacrificed their lives in the cause of science. Another scene of activity was centered in Spitzbergen, for crossing which in 1896 Sir Martin Conway and party received the applause of the world. The following year he again returned to continue his explorations. Dr. A.G. Nahorst circumnavigated Spitzbergen in 1898, surveying and mapping the irregular coastline with admirable precision. The same year, Professor J.H. Gore of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey made pendulum observations in Spitzbergen for the determination of the force of gravity in that latitude. Prince Albert of Monaco and the party cruised along the coast for the purpose of making scientific observations. So active had been the interest in this hitherto unclaimed archipelago that Russia began to assert her rights to ownership. The most unique venture for the polar honors was undertaken in 1897 by Solomon August André, a Swede whose two companions, Mr. Steinberg and Mr. Trenkel, from Dane Island north of Spitzbergen. André was an ardent apostle of aerial conquest of the North Pole. His balloon, the Ornan, had a cubical contents of 4,500 meters, and the shape of a spear terminating in a slightly conical appendage. The envelope was made of 600 pieces of Bunge silk, each being from 17 to 18 meters long, about 48 centimeters wide. These were sewn together by machines, then subjugated to a process of cementing with a special varnish. A carefully made net composed of hemp cords encompassed the envelope. Special valves were devised by André. The car was of a cane basket work, mounted on a frame of chestnut wood, the bottom being strengthened by wood cross beams, the whole covered with tarpaulin with necessary openings, provisioned with tins of preserved food, chocolate, compressed bread, condensed milk, champagne, claret, butter, fresh water, and alcohol, besides a cooking apparatus and other necessary equipment. This frail craft made its ascension with its human freight July 11, 1897. The last farewells were brief and touching, writes Alexis Macaron. Few words are exchanged, but hearty handclasps between those whose hearts are in sympathy say more than words. Suddenly, André snatches himself away from the embraces of his friends and takes his place on the wicker bridge of the car, from whence he calls in a firm voice, "Steinberg, Freinunkel, let's go!" His two companions at once take their places beside him. Each is armed with a knife for cutting ropes supporting the groups of the ballast bags. André is always calm, cold, and impassible. Not a trace of emotion is visible. Nothing but expression of firm resolution and indomitable will. He is just the man for such an enterprise, and he is well seconded by his two companions. At length the decisive moment arrives. 1, 2, cut! Cries André in Swedish. The three sailors obey the orders simultaneously, and in 1 second the aerial ship, free and unfettered, rises majestically into space, saluted by our heartiest cheers. Scattered along the shore we stand motionless, with full hearts and anxious eyes, gazing at the silent horizon. For some moments then, between two hills, we perceive a gray speck over the sea, very, very far away, and then it finally disappears. The way to the pole is clear. No more obstacles to encounter. The sea, the ice fields, and the unknown. André. Out of the great white north came a lone survivor, a carrier pigeon, bringing the tidings written July 13th, 12:30 p.m., 82 degrees, 2 minutes north latitude, 15 degrees, 5 minutes east longitude. Good journey eastward, 10 degrees south. All goes well on board. This is the fourth message sent by pigeon. Ah, but all did not go well. In June 1899, a buoy containing a note from André was found in Norway. It had been thrown out 8 hours after departure. The North Pole buoy, to be dropped when the pole was passed, was found empty in September 1899, on the north side of King Charles Island. A third buoy, almost empty, was picked up on the west coast of Iceland, July 17, 1900, and another reported from Norway, August 31, 1900, contained a note stating that the buoy was thrown out at 10 p.m., July 11, 1897, at an altitude of 823 feet, moving north 45 east. Thus, the carrier pigeon was the last messenger, the harbinger of André's last word to friends on earth. The fate of the three brave spirits lies buried in the Arctic silence. Theodore Lerner was one of the first to hurry to Spitzbergen in 1898, leading the German scientific expedition to obtain news from André if possible, and the same year the Swedish Anthropological and Geographical Society sent J. Stradling with companions to the Lena Delta, the mouth of the Yenisei, and the islands of New Siberia, where they searched in vain for traces of their missing compatriots. Again in 1899, Dr. A.G. Nathorst returned his attention to eastern Greenland in an unsuccessful search for tidings of André, making valuable maps and observations of the fjord system of King Oscar Fjord. Nor did Captain Bade in his explorations in East Spitzbergen, King Charles Land, and Franz Josef Land in 1900 find any traces of the missing aeronaut. In the year 1894, Walter Wellman, an American, made Spitsbergen the base of his activities in an attempt to penetrate the polar pack and reach the North Pole. Sailing in the Ragnvald Jarl, he had the misfortune to lose his ship off of Walden Island. Undaunted by his grave disaster, he pushed north with sledges as far as 81 degrees, but had to retrace his steps owing to the impenetrable condition of the ice. He had, however, reached the north point of Platten Island. Wellman again endeavored to conquer the ice in 1898, this time choosing for his base Franz Josef Land. He was liberally fitted out and accompanied, among others, by Evelyn B. Baldwin of the United States Weather Bureau. Mr. Wellman made his headquarters at Harmsworth House at Cape Tegethoff for 3 years, the Arctic home of Frederick A. Jackson and his companions. In February 1899, Mr. Wellman and the 3 companions started for the pole with every promise of success. An unforeseen accident to Mr. Wellman and an upheaval in the ice, which destroyed many dogs and much of their equipment, necessitated a hurried return to headquarters. Disappointed but not discouraged, Wellman organized a series of important scientific observations and explorations, during which Evelyn Baldwin, in a long sledge journey to Wilczek Land, determined its eastern boundary and discovered, among other islands to the northeast, Graham Bell Island. To that daring and adventurous prince, HRH Luigi Amadeo of Savoy, the Duke of Abruzzi, is one of the most interesting chapters in Arctic history. There is a charm in the graceful dedication of his book, To Her Majesty the Queen Mother, as well as his gallant tribute to his brave companions who won laurels under his direction and fought gallantly in the dangers of the Arctic under his banner. Italians and Norwegians behaved throughout this voyage as though they were a crew composed of one nationality, he says. I had the comrades with me rather than the subordinates. I express therefore my gratitude towards all, since to their harmonious cooperation is due the success of my expedition, and I express the same gratitude to the memory of the 3 brave men who perished whilst on the sledge expedition. The Jason, having carrying a capacity of 570 tons cargo, was purchased by the Duke, renamed the Stella Polar, refitted, equipped, provisioned, and manned for 4 years, at the total cost of £38,413 sterling. The second in command to the Duke of Abruzzi, who, by the way, was but 26 years old at the time of his adventure, was Captain Umberto Cagni of the Italian Navy, in charge of the scientific operations. The other officers of the Navy were Lieutenant Francisco Cruini, in charge of the mineralogical collections, and Dr. Achille C. Molinelli, medical officer, also in charge of the zoological and botanical collections. 4 other officers, a crew of 12, and 4 especially experienced guides completed the personnel of the expedition. Under the personal advice and superintendence of Dr. Nansen, who aided in every possible way the success of the expedition, a carefully thought-out plan was made by which the Stella Polar was to leave Archangel early in July, make for Cape Flora in the Northbrook Island, establish a depot provisioned for 8 months, then proceed to take up winter quarters as far north as possible. Close to the lands lying west of Franz Josef Land, sledge journeys in the autumn would establish a chain of provision caches on the lands to the north, and in the spring of a sledge journey to the north for a world record would be undertaken. A retreat to the depot at Cape Flora, with or without the ship, would ensure subsistence until the arrival of a relief ship could be sent in 2 years. Or, if the relief ship failed, a retreat to Nova Zembla or Spitsbergen would be undertaken by boats. On June 30th, 1899, the Stella Polar reached Archangel, where 121 dogs were taken aboard to be used in the sledge journeys. On 12th of July, she weighed anchor and proceeded on her voyage. Ice was encountered. July 17th, and 3 days later, Northbrook Island was sighted, and a visit was made to Jackson's huts and Lee Smith's winter quarters. The Stella Polar bravely fought her way through unfavorable ice conditions and succeeded in reaching 82 degrees 4 minutes north, 59 degrees east by the British Channel, securing an anchorage in Teplitz Bay, Prince Rudolf Land. She received a disastrous nip September 7th when she sprang a leak, and it became necessary to disembark her provisions and establish winter quarters on Rudolf Land. As our ship, which we had abandoned after it had been seized by the ice, writes the Duke of Abruzzi, was the only means of our returning home in the following year, we had to consider how to save her. Part of the engines, the condenser, and the furnaces were under water. which had frozen to a thickness of about 19 inches. The ship had not changed her position, but had heeled over some still more, as the ice which supported her had given way. The water had first to be pumped out of the ship to enable us to find the leak on the left side, and this had to be mended as well, that which was visible on the right side. We had then to see if it would be possible to keep the ship dry, and if not, to protect the engine so that we might remain under water during the winter without being injured. Such was the work before us. At that time I did not believe it possible, but Captain Cagney never despaired for a moment of being able to carry it out, and if it was accomplished, it was owing to his strong will and to his perseverance, which was never discouraged by any difficulties. Early in the winter, the Duke of Abruzzi, in which one of his sled excursions, had the misfortune to freeze part of his left hand, which resulted in the loss of the joints of 2 of his fingers. This unfortunate accident prevented his accompanying the spring sledge journey to the north, for which active preparations were already in progress. The sledges and kayaks were patterned after those used by Dr. Nansen. The former 11 feet 5 inches long, 6 inches wide, and 6 1/2 inches high, was the convex runner shod with plates of white metal, and were saturated with a mixture of pitch, stearine, and tallow, to render them more slippery and durable. After careful calculations by Dr. Molinelli, the rations to be carried were estimated at 2 pounds 12 ounces, 9 drams per day for each man, consisting of biscuit, tinned meat, pemmican, butter, milk, Liebig's extract, desiccated vegetables, Italian paste, sugar, coffee, tea, chocolate, etc. The first start was made in February, but after traveling in the extreme cold for several days, the party returned and made a fresh start March 11th. The expedition was composed of 10 men and 13 sledges, which with their loads weighed 551 pounds each and was drawn by 102 dogs. It had been previously settled to send back detachments after 12, 24, and 36 days. The last detachment remained in the field 72 days. Cagney, however, modified these plans, and in the meantime the Duke of Abruzzi anxiously waited the return of the first detachment. On April 18th, the second detachment returned to camp. They had left Commander Cagney March 31st. The first detachment, consisting of Lieutenant Carini, Stolkin, and Ollier, had started to return March 23rd. An immediate search was instituted for the missing men, but without results. After every effort had been expended, the 3 men were given up for lost. Meantime, the other supporting parties having returned, anxiety was beginning to manifest itself for Cagney. The day set for his return had come and gone. On May 19th, Dr. Molini and 2 companions had set out for Cape Fliggy with provisions for 10 days to look for him. The Duke of Abruzzi anxiously scanned the horizon with his telescope for signs of missing companions. After an absence of 104 days, Captain Cagney, with 3 companions, having made a world record and reached 86 degrees 34 minutes, was sighted in the distance and welcomed home by his impatient and enthusiastic companions. Although their strength had been much reduced, writes Abruzzi, by want of sufficient food, they were not exhausted. The 7 dogs which survived seemed much worse. Some of them were merely skin and bone. The only part of their outfit had brought back was still capable of being of any use, was their tent, and this had been mended. The framework of all the kayaks had been broken, and their canvas torn, so they could not be used unless a week was spent mending them. The sledges which remained had been mended with pieces of other sledges. All of that was left of their cooking utensils was the outer covering of the stove, a saucepan which had been mended, and the plates. The Primus lamp had been replaced by a pot, in which dog's grease had been burned for the last few weeks. The sleeping bag had been thrown away, and only the thick canvas lining kept. Their clothes were in rags. Cagney had advanced under the same trying conditions of hummocky ice, slush, and deep snow, which had been encountered by Nansen. He had the misfortune to freeze one of his fingers and suffered excruciating pain, necessitating his operating with his own hand and removing the dead mass with a pair of scissors. He had steadily advanced until April 25, 1900. His return journey covered 60 days under the most alarming conditions, for on May 18th he writes, "I feel more and more every day a terrible anxiety with regard to our fate. After marching 9 days toward the southeast, we are nearly on the same meridian, owing to the southwest drift of the ice pack. 4 weeks more of almost superhuman effort brought them to Harley Island, from which point they made their way to Rudolph Island. With the achievement of this brilliant record, it now remained but to free the Stella Polar by blasting and cutting channels about her snug quarters. The brief Arctic summer having set in, her deliverance was last secured. At 1:30 in the morning of August 16, everything was ready, and we steamed slowly away from the shore, giving 3 cheers as we turned round the ice of the bay which had held us so long imprisoned. In contrast to the Italian expedition, the Baldwin-Ziegler Polar Expedition, to which sailed from Tromsø, Norway, July 17, 1900, stands out conspicuously. Mr. Baldwin was born in Springfield, Missouri in 1862, and he had seen Arctic service with the Peary Expedition of 1893 through 1894, and had come near being one of the ill-fated André Balloon party. He had done good service with Wellman in Franz Josef Land, and now, with the unlimited means put at his disposal by the munificence of Mr. Wilman Ziegler of New York, he proposed to conquer the pole. "Our fleet," wrote Mr. Baldwin in McClure's Magazine, September 1901, "comprises 3 vessels. The America, our flagship, as someone expressed it, is a 3-masted ship-rigged steamer of 466 tons net burden, driving a single screw. Her length overall was 157 feet, beam 27 feet, depth 19 feet. The Frivia is a Norwegian sailing vessel. The 3rd vessel is the Belgia, which carried the Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 through 1899 under Captain Gerlache. Never before in the history of polar expeditions was food and equipment carried in such luxurious profusion. The 3 vessels were as many floating hotels with larders lacking nothing but foresight, experience, and the generosity of Mr. Ziegler could suggest or procure. The scientific equipment was also complete, including small balloons with releasing devices for depositing records when the ground was reached, buoys with records to be sent floating back to civilization by currents, searchlights, and wireless telegraph. Beside the standard scientific instruments for meteorological, astronomical, and geodetic work, there were 320 dogs and 15 ponies in charge of 6 expert Russian drivers. The present expedition, wrote Mr. Baldwin, typifies the spirit of the 20th century. And he adds, no previous expedition to the north has ever made such complete arrangements for the transmission of news back to civilization as that which I have the honor to command. The America and Frithjof left Tromsø, Norway, in July of 1901 for Franz Josef Land, which Baldwin regarded as the best starting point for a polar adventure, writes Mr. P. F. McGrath in the Review of Reviews, July 1905. Proceeding to Alger Island in a latitude of 80 degrees 24 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 52 minutes east, where he established his winter quarters. The Frithjof unloaded her stores and proceeded south, leaving the America harbored with the dogs and equipment ashore, portable houses erected, and a detail of duties being carried out. The personnel comprised of 42 souls, 17 Americans, 6 Russians, and 19 shipmen, mostly Norwegians. Game was plentiful, and several tons of bear and walrus meat were accumulated, the former for the men and the latter for the dogs. With this base beyond the 18th parallel, Baldwin intended to push forward with his ship over the ice, exploring the adjacent region for uncharted land masses, which would supply stationary points, ensuring him against the disadvantages of an advance across the shifting ice. And the furthest north of these he would, next spring, make his dash across the crystal fields for the pole. In this he would employ about 25 men as vanguard and reserve, the flying column pushing rapidly ahead, and the transport train following with the heavier supplies. Numerically, the party would be strong enough to overcome otherwise serious obstacles, while the quantity of supplies to be carried by 320 dogs and 15 ponies would put the possibility of disaster almost out of question. With this elaborate program, and the knowledge that the Duke of Abruzzi, with much smaller party, obtained a northing of 86 degrees 33 minutes, Baldwin confidently anticipated making the pole, and as in this segment of the Arctic Circle he might find himself, in returning, obliged by ice and currents to head for the Greenland coast, which reaches 83 degrees 27 minutes, or 180 miles nearer the pole than his base. He planned that if he should be swerved westward by the tides, it would be easier to reach that shore, and he would find musk oxen to eke out his supplies, and the journey down the east coast, where the depot was made by the Belgica, for him. But often happens in polar work, Baldwin's hopes were blasted. Dissensions rent his party asunder. His dogs perished by the score, and after a futile attempt to get north, he and his whole party returned to Tromoso in August 1902, while the Frithiof, which had sailed for Alger Island a month previous with additional outfits and news for him, had to retreat, owing to the unbroken ice pack. The return of the Baldwin-Ziegler expedition in the autumn of 1902 was followed by that reorganized by Mr. Ziegler and given to the leadership of Mr. Anthony Fiala of Brooklyn, New York, to be carried out on practically the same lines laid out by Mr. Baldwin. Captain Edward Coffin of Edgartown, Massachusetts, was chosen as the navigating officer, and he assembled an American crew, most of them experienced whalers. Of the field staff, Mr. William J. Peters of the Geological Survey, and representing the National Geographic Society, was chosen as chief scientist and second in command of the expedition. The results of his systematic records and magnetical observations when in the north were of the highest value, and he rendered the most efficient service. After collecting stores and equipment, the America sailed from Trondheim, Norway, June 23, 1903. Brief stops were made at the island of Tromo and Archangel, where dogs, ponies, and additional stores were taken aboard. The ice was first met July 13th in 74 degrees 51 minutes north latitude, 38 degrees 37 minutes east longitude, through which the America steamed and blasted her way to Cape Flora, which was reached August 12th. A few days later, Triplets Bay was passed, with the skeleton-like remains of the framework of the tent where lived the brave Abruzzi and his companions standing out in plain view. The America made the highest northing of a ship under steam in the western hemisphere, and reached a point of 82 degrees north latitude. She then returned to Triplets Bay. Upon landing, Fiala found the Abruzzi cache in excellent condition. Camp Abruzzi was established, and scientific work at once begun, and preparations commenced for the spring sledge journey to the north. Several gales struck in early October and continued almost unremittingly until the last of the month, when they raged with such fury as to threaten the safety of the ship, and she bravely withstood the terrible ice pressures to which she was subjected to until January 23, when during a frightful hurricane she disappeared from view. The first week in March, a sledging journey was undertaken, comprising 26 men, 16 pony sledges, and 13 dog sledges. But the severity of storms, and the suffering and hardships enduring from cold, decided the party to return, and camp was reached on March 11. Other journeys of short duration were undertaken with similar success. Leaving part of the company at Camp Abruzzi, Fiala made a retreat to Cape Flora, there to await the promised ship relief, which was expected early August. His idea was to renew his North Pole dash the following season. The expected ship was eagerly watched for, but as the months sped by one, the ship did not come, and preparations were made for wintering. And in the liberal depots of the supplies left by Jackson, Abruzzi, and Andre were examined and found in excellent condition. Elmwood, Jackson's little house, was dug out and made habitable. Communication was frequent between Camp Abruzzi and Elmwood. Fiala, in a cold, dangerous journey, returned to Camp Abruzzi, where he made preparations for another spring journey toward the pole, to be undertaken with one companion, 3 dog teams, and a supporting column of 3 small detachments. Seaman Duffy, who had accompanied Fiala to Cape Barents in August 1904 and Camp Flora in June of the same year, was chosen as his companion. The start was made in March, but very slow progress was made. After days of disheartening travel, covering but few miles a day, the conditions grew worse instead of better. Our trail was from ice cake to ice cake, writes Fiala, while we crossed the separating water by means of ice bridges, laboriously constructed at the narrowest points with our ice picks. In other places we traversed monster pressure ridges that splintered and thundered under our feet, scaring the dogs until they whined and whimpered in their terror. It was difficult to find a cake of ice large enough for our small party to camp on. Deep snow and numerous water lanes, with a high temperature and attendant fog, also impeded our advance. On March 22nd, the advance was abandoned, and 10 days were occupied in the retreat. Camp Abruzzi was reached April 1st. The relief ship Terra Nova reached Cape Flora at the end of July, picked up the party and camped there, and touching at Cape Dillon, took aboard the remainder. It was then learned that in 1904 the Frithiof had made 2 bold attempts to reach Cape Flora, but had been unsuccessful. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jim Dykstra, Farragut, Iowa. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 22. Otto Sverdrup. 4 years' voyage of the Fram. Journeys in Ellesmere Land. Important exploration of Jones Sound. Discovery of new lands. Release of the Fram. Captain Roald Amundsen. The voyage of the Joa. Reaches head of Peterson Bay, King William Land. 2-year stay. Valuable scientific observations. Visits from Eskimos. Sledge journeys. Release from the ice. August 14, 1906. Completion of the Northwest Passage. Another Arctic winter. Sledge journey of Amundsen to Eagle City. Release of the Joa. Reaches San Francisco, 1907. In the Geographical Journal of November 1902, Sir Clements R. Markham, President of the Royal Geographical Society of London, commenting on the remarkable achievement of Otto Sverdrup and his gallant companions during 4 traveling seasons entailing 4 Arctic winters, expresses himself as follows. They have discovered the western side of Ellesmere Island and the intricate system of fjords, as well as 3 large islands west of Ellesmere Island. They have explored the northern coast of North Devon. They have connected Belcher's work with the coasts of Jones Sound. They have reached a point within 60 miles of Aldrich's farthest, and they have discovered that land north of the Peary Islands, the existence of which was conjectured as far west as the longitude of the eastern coast of Melville Island. This includes the discovery of the northern sides of North Cornwall and Findlay Islands. In addition to the main Arctic problem which is thus solved, it is likely that the regions discovered will be of exceptional interest, from the winds and currents, the varying character of the ice, the existence of coal beds, and the abundance of animal life. A systematic survey has been made of these important discoveries, checked by astronomical observations. We must look forward, concludes Markham, to an account of these things, and to the details of the expedition, with the deepest interest, and meanwhile we may well express admiration for the way in which the work was conceived and executed, and at the perfect harmony with which all loyally worked under their chief. Without such harmonious work, success was not possible. The Norwegian Otto Neumann Sverdrup was born in Bindalen in Helgeland in 1855. At 17 years of age he went to sea, passed his mate's examination in 1878, and for some years was captain of a ship. He accompanied Nansen on the Greenland expedition in 1888 to 1889, and was captain of the Fram on Nansen's famous polar voyage. A few days after the return of this expedition, in September 1896, while the Fram was lying in Lysaker Bay, Dr. Nansen came aboard one morning. "Do you still wish to go on another expedition to the north?" he asked Sverdrup. "Yes, certainly, if only I had the chance," came the prompt reply. Then Nansen told him that Consul Axel Heiberg and the firm of brewers, Messrs. Ringnes Brothers, were willing to finance and equip another scientific polar expedition, with Captain Sverdrup as leader. The Fram was loaned by the Norwegian government, and about 1,100 pounds was granted by the Storthing for necessary alterations and repairs. The personnel of the expedition was most carefully selected, including Lieutenant Victor Bandman of the Norwegian Navy, Lieutenant Ingvald Isaacson of the Army, the botanist Herman George Simmons, a graduate of the University of Lund, and Edvard Bay, zoologist, a graduate of the University of Copenhagen, the latter a member of Lieutenant Ryder's expedition to the east coast of Greenland in 1891. The Fram was ready for sea June 24, 1898, and left her moorings with the quay packed with people and the fjord covered with small craft, which had come to see the last of us and wish us a safe return home. Captain Sverdrup's original plan was to push through Kennedy and Robeson channels, and as far along the north coast of Greenland as possible before seeking winter quarters. The unfavorable seasons of 1898 to 1899 prevented him from carrying out his intentions, and he fortunately turned his attention to Jones Sound, which led to the completion of the most important Arctic work yet remaining, namely, the discovery of what was hitherto unknown in the wide gap between Prince Patrick Island and Aldrich's farthest. Frustrated in his attempt to enter Kane Basin, Sverdrup wintered in Rice Strait, west of Cape Sabine. Immediate preparations were made for passing the cold season, and scientific observations and exploring trips occupied the autumn. In describing the sun sinking out of sight Sunday, October 16, 1898, Sverdrup says, "We were looking at the sun for the last time that year. Its pale light lay dying over the inland ice. Its disk, light red, was veiled on the horizon. It was like a day in the land of the dead. All light was so hopelessly cold, all life so far away. We stood and watched it until it sank. Then everything became so still it made one shudder, as if the Almighty had deserted us and shut the gates of heaven. The light died away across the mountains and slowly vanished, while over us crept the great shades of the polar night, the night that kills all life. I think that each of us, as we stood there, felt his heart swell within him. Never before had we experienced homesickness like this, and little was said when we continued on our way. Here came Franklin with 138 men. The polar night stopped him, and not one returned. Here came Greeley with 25 men. 6 returned. Well, there lay the Fram, stout and defiant, like a little fairy house in the midst of the polar night. It was warm and bright in her cabins, and we worked with a will from morning to night. Sledge journeys, including a visit to the Windward, Lieutenant Peary's ship, and a personal interview with the explorer himself, visits to the Fram by neighboring Eskimos, and a brilliant journey across Ellesmere Land, occupied members of the Sverdrup expedition until May 17, 1899, when those on board the Fram celebrated with true patriotism the Independence Day of Norway. On one of the early summer sledge journeys, Dr. Johan Svensson sacrificed his life. Overrating his endurance, he had rapidly failed, and though he persisted in remaining in the field, his strength did not return. After a day's work, Sverdrup came into camp, where Schley and Simmons were cooking dinner. The doctor said he felt much better, writes Sverdrup. The pain in his side was gone, and his eyes had so far recovered that he could sit inside the tent without spectacles. I then asked him for a second time if he would not let me take him on board, now that we had all rested, but he would not hear of it, and said that he should prefer to remain where he was. I then offered to stay behind with him. We could collect insects and shoot seals together, but he would not let me defer the journey to Bedstad Fjord, and said that the time would pass quickly, even when he was there alone. He could go out shooting, collect insects, and look after his dogs. He would have plenty to do. We got ready for our 4 days' trip to Bedstad Fjord, and the doctor helped us to carry down our things, lash the loads to the sledges, and harness the dogs. And then we said goodbye to one another, little thinking what was about to happen. 4 days later, the absent party returned. To our great sorrow, we found the doctor dead. On June 16, 1899, Captain Sverdrup made the entry in his journal. The flag is flying at half-mast from the pole today. It is the first time it has been in this position on board the Fram. Let us hope it will indeed be the last. The interesting journey across the inland ice of Ellesmere Land by Isaacson and Braskerud was undertaken May 23, 1899, with food for 30 days and instruments and equipment, a total weight of 872 pounds, divided equally upon the sledges, each drawn by 6 dogs. Choosing a route to the westward, Isaacson writes in his report, "About midnight on June 2, we saw from the high ground to the northwest the first sight of what later proved the west coast. It was a fjord arm, which cut into the land in an easterly direction from the larger fjord lying almost due north and south. From the outer part of this fjord arm, a chain of mountains of equal heights ran in a southeasterly direction. Nearer, and in front of this chain, was a wide level waste, Brackendelia. There was no snow either on the waste or on the mountains. In one part only of the chain was a fragment of glacier to be seen hanging over the upper part of the mountainside. In the southeast, the waste abutted immediately on the inland ice. Traveling over a glacier, they endeavored to reach the bare land of the fjord. This they succeeded in doing, June 4. 3 converging glaciers fell into a glacier lake, and the following day we drove on this down the valley, but only for a couple of miles, which was the extent of its length. The ice on it was about to break up. Having encamped, the 2 men rambled over a considerable area in the vicinity, finding luxuriant vegetation wherever there was bare land. At a distance some 10 or 11 miles in a northwesterly direction, there was no inland ice west of the northernmost glaciers previously mentioned. After continuing their explorations for several days, they were forced to return through continued bad weather, fogs, and gales. On June 22, the 30th day since leaving the ship, the food supply remaining was reduced to about 50 biscuits, 10½ tablets of compressed lentils, about 4 pounds of pemmican, enough coffee for twice, 6 whole rounds or 72 rations of dog food, and a half-gallon of petroleum. After a delay of 6 days by the inclement weather and a slow and difficult progress to the top of Leffert Glacier, it was with joy that a relief party from the ship were met with, and the following day we drove down Leffert Glacier on splendid snow, and reached the Fram on Sunday, July 2, at 5 in the morning. On August 4, the conditions being more favorable than heretofore, Captain Sverdrup endeavored to navigate the Fram through Kane Basin. In Peary Harbor, an American steamer was sighted going northeast. To the joy of all, the steamer signaled she had letters on board for the Norwegians. The attempt to penetrate Kane Basin was unsuccessful. The Fram was forced back to Falk Fjord, a short distance from one of Peary's ships. Captain Bartlett, Dr. Dietrich, and 1 or 2 other members of the expedition exchanged courtesies with the Norwegians. Mr. Bridgman and Professor Libby came aboard the Fram. It was learned that the mail brought north had been left at Peary Harbor. The Fram endeavored to get it, but the impenetrable pack prevented, and after the most desperate efforts they gave up in despair. It was at this juncture, after the abandonment of the plan to trace the northern extremity of Greenland, that Sverdrup transferred his base to the fjords of the north coast of Jones Sound. Securing no less than 33 walrus for dog food, the Fram established the second winter quarters at Havne Fjord, in 96 degrees 29 minutes north, 84 degrees 25 minutes west. Game and seals were found in plenty during the autumn. Also, musk oxen, hares, and reindeer. Most successful scientific researches were promoted. Sledging parties continued explorations, and the only event to mar a happy autumn was the death of Braskerud. He had had a very bad cold and was ill a fortnight with a cough and had great difficulty in breathing, but had suffered no pain. There was no doctor, and nothing could be done to relieve him. He had kept his bed the last 3 days of his illness, and no one dreamed the end was so near. Preparations for the grand sledge journey of the spring kept the men busy during the winter, and early in the season Isaacson, Bay, Shea, and Stoltz, each man with a full load, went to examine the outlying depots placed the previous fall. At Bjornborg, the ravages of bears had caused loss of food and damaged equipment, and this serious menace to the success of the future journeys decided Captain Sverdrup to place a watchman at this lonely and isolated spot. Bay, the zoologist, volunteered for the duty and was appointed Commandant of Bjornborg. On March 7, writes Sverdrup, Fosheim and I started west in company with the newly appointed commandant. A little after 12 the following day we arrived at the boathouse. After finishing our work, we had dinner which was as sustaining as it was splendid, and consisted of boiled beef, sausage, soup, and green peas. After dinner we had drams and coffee, and after supper, grog. Early next morning, and on good ice, we drove on, running by the side of the loads nearly the whole day to increase the pace. We reached Bjornborg in the evening, where we found our new depot was in good order. Next day we set to work on the erection of the commandant's residence. We built a very respectable house. Like other residences of the kind, Bjornborg must have its flag, we thought, and as we were in possession of a flagstaff, which, considering our circumstances, was irreproachable, we secured it to the roof, and ran up a 17th of May flag. But our commandant was economical, and would only use it on occasions of a special ceremony. Here Bay lived, absolutely alone for 3 months, and during the first part of the time without so much as a living being for company. Afterwards he had a garrison consisting of a whole watchdog. During all this long period, I never saw him out of spirits. The following day, Sverdrup and Fosheim made an examination of the ice, which in the fjords was rugged and hummocky. Upon the return to the ship, it was decided that Bandmann, leading the supporting party, should leave the ship Saturday, March 17, with full loads, with Bjornborg as their destination, returning thence to the boathouse to fetch provisions and dog food, which were to be used on the approaching journeys westward. For these journeys, Isaacson and Hassel were to make one party, Fosheim and Sverdrup the second, Shea and Petter the third. All were to meet at Bjornborg on March 21, later to separate and journey in different directions. The following rations were allotted to the different parties. Bandmann and his men, 240 days' rations, about 530 pounds. Isaacson and Hassel, 100 days' rations, about 220 pounds. Sverdrup and Fosheim, 100 days' rations, about 200 pounds. Shea and Petter, 80 days' rations, about 175 pounds. Bay, 90 days' rations, about 200 pounds. The great expedition, upon which so much thought and care had been expended, was ready to start, March 20, 1900. The weather was beautiful, writes Sverdrup, and we drove out through the Sound, east of Skreya, at a smart pace, taking, when south of it, a line direct for South Cape. On this journey, in which Sverdrup and Fosheim traced the west shore of Ellesmere Land to 80 degrees 50 minutes north, a serious yet amusing incident occurred. At certain places on our way, writes Sverdrup, we came across huge rocks, some of which were as big as a cottage, and round them the snow had drifted to such a height that we could only just see the top. When we came nearer, we found that, as a rule, the wind had hollowed out a large empty space between the drift, and we were often met by a yawning pitfall 12 to 18 feet in depth. I should mention that we were obliged to drive above the rocks, as below was the open sea. It once happened that, just as we were passing a rock of this kind, a gap occurred between my sledge and the one following it. As soon as I became aware of this, I pulled up, but almost before I knew what was taking place, the dogs had made their usual frantic rush to catch up, and the sledge, men, and team were precipitated into the hole 12 feet below. A moment afterwards, before anything could be done to prevent it, the next sledge came tearing up and fell into the hole, and on the heels of number 2 came a third, which followed their example. In the grave lay pell-mell 3 men, 18 dogs, and 3 sledges with their loads, and the snow was flying up from it in clouds. Here and there a sledge runner or a sealskin strap was sticking out. Then I saw one of the men crawling out of the medley and pulling himself together. Then another and another. Thank God they were all alive. And the dogs? They were lying in a black heap, one team on top of the other, kicking, howling, and fighting, till we could hardly hear the men's voices for their noise. So apparently they too were alive. As soon as we had hauled them all up, we set to work to shovel part of the drift away so that we could drag up the loads. The first sledge, which, after much toil, we succeeded in bringing up, strange to say, was whole, nor was there anything wrong with number 2, while number 3 was as intact as the 2 former. The very astonishing result of this flight through the air was, therefore, that not a limb, nor a lashing, nor bit of wood was broken. While the travelers were in the field pursuing their perilous and exciting adventures, the commandant at Bjornborg was leading a lonely and monotonous life, awaiting his chance to annihilate marauding Bruins. His first call to arms came soon after Captain Sverdrup's departure. Late one night, while half asleep, the commandant, at that time without a garrison, thought he heard a faint sound in the depot. I only turned round in the bag, he says, and inwardly cursed Hassel's dogs, which were loose again and ransacking the depot. I was on the point of falling asleep once more when it began to dawn on me that my reasoning had been wrong, for there were no dogs within many miles, and therewith I heard a crash which seemed to make the earth tremble. A moment later I was out of the bag, had dragged my gun from its cover, and cocked it, for it suddenly occurred to me that my guest was a serious one. The first thing I did was to light the lamp, after which I began to move away some tins I had put in front of the door, that night for the first time, to keep it in place. The sound still continued at the depot, but in moving the last tin, I happened to make a slight noise, and then everything became as still as death. I raised the door and crept out. It was 1 o'clock. I had looked at my watch when I lit the lamp, and much darker than was pleasant for the work before me. The bear, meanwhile, had made itself quite at home. In order to get at one of the blubber cases, it had thrust the empty boxes out of its way, and had thrown down one of the dog food boxes which had been placed on the cases of blubber. The marks of all its claws were clearly visible in the tin. The other box was open, and the bear had tasted a couple of rations, but had evidently not found them to his liking, for he had spat them out again into the box. It had then very carefully lifted the tin down onto the snow, and then, also very carefully, raised the lid of the blubber box. But just as it was going to begin its meal, it had evidently heard my clatter inside the hut, and had sat down to listen, with its right paw clasping the edge of the box. It was in this position, at any rate, that I found it, when I raised myself up, after creeping out. The bear was about 15 yards away from me, and as soon as it saw me rose, large and fat and hissing, it made the open tin rattle as it put its left paw down on it. It looked just as if it were thumping the table to show what a fine fellow it was, and reminded me of one of my friends on board. so much so that I half unwittingly addressed it in the way usual between us, a manner, however, hardly fit for publication. Whether the bear felt offended at this, I know not, but certain it is that it got up and walked, growling, with long measured steps round the depot. I aimed and shot it in the shoulder. I could just discern the sights through the darkness. The bear uttered such a loud growl, continues the commandant, that it seemed to make the stillness ring. The fire from my gun had dazzled me, and I could no longer see the sights, and the bear itself I only saw as a shapeless mass, which seemed to have grown most incredibly larger. The other barrel, the small shot barrel, which was loaded with a large ball, I fired straight into the mass without going through any such formality as aiming. Then I made a well-ordered retreat behind the hut and put in some fresh cartridges. I do not much believe in hurrying, but I did this in less time than it takes to tell. To my great astonishment, I did not see anything, not that I wanted to, of my enemy during this operation, but as soon as I was ready, I began to peer about after it, though at first without success. At last, on bending down, I caught sight of a large dark object a short distance away at a spot where I knew there was no rock. This, of course, must be the bear, but whether dead or alive it was impossible to tell. I therefore advanced with much caution and fired a shot at what I supposed to be its head. On closer examination, it proved to be the other end of the bear I had bombarded. But as a zoologist, I, of course, knew that the head in Ursus maritimus is, as a rule, exactly at the opposite extremity to the after end of the animal, and at last really succeeded in giving it some lead in the right place. The bear had, no doubt, been dead for some time, but discretion is the better part of valor. I then realized that I had killed my first bear. To say that I was proud is nowhere near the mark. The commandant had other visits from bears while leading the hermit's life at Bjornborg, and the killing of a seal was also added to his achievements. On June 2, however, he left the castle where he had lived alone for almost a quarter of a year. It was not without a feeling of sadness, he writes, that I saw the last glimpse of the spot as we rounded the steep bluffs of Stormcap. For, although my life there had been solitary and monotonous enough, except on occasions when it had been extremely lively, I felt I was leaving a home where I knew every stone and every irregularity of the ground, a place I had known in calm and the glory of sunshine, as well as during the raging of the storms. And then, too, I had a feeling as if peace and quietness were at an end. For east of the Stormcap began for me the great busy world, which for so long now I had almost forgotten. A serious fire occurred on board the Fram, May 27, 1900. A spark from the galley falling upon the winter awning was supposed to be the cause of the conflagration. The loss of paraffin-prepared kayaks, a quantity of skis, and wood and other valuables were consumed, but the chief danger, which threatened the safety of the ship and all on board, was the proximity of the fire to an iron tank containing 50 gallons of spirit. So great was the heat of the fire that, though the tank held, the tinning on the outside was found melted. On August 9, after a summer of successful research, the conditions being favorable, Captain Sverdrup decided to push westward with the Fram. Through the ice-free sound all went well, he writes, but farther out, east of the rocks, we entered the ice, and lay there ramming the whole day long. Whenever we got a chance, we forged on full speed ahead, and when perforce we came to a standstill, we backed to get an impetus, and gave another ram. Skirting the coast, the Fram pushed her difficult course to within about 1.5 miles from North Devon, where on September 3, 1900, the ship was made ready for her third winter in the Arctic. On the 15th, a storm disrupted the pack, and quick action on the part of officers and men was required to prepare the Fram for the opening of the ice which suddenly released her. As quickly as possible she was bearing toward Cardigan Strait, and steered through in easy waters, finally anchoring in the good winter harbor of Gasfjord. The land in the vicinity of this harbor was rich in game, fauna, and interesting fossils. Captain Sverdrup describes a curious experience while out hunting. In a small valley he discovered countless hare tracks, which crossed and recrossed one another in every direction, the snow in places having been trodden in hard runs. Calling his telescope to his aid, he made out what he had mistaken for a group of white stones a short distance off to be a group of Arctic hares, 31 in number, evidently at rest, with one plainly acting as sentinel. Although Sverdrup approached with great caution, the hare on guard suddenly took alarm and, starting up, ran wildly round her flock, striking her hind legs on the ground till it fairly resounded, then setting off at a brisk pace over the ridge of a hill, the others following in a long line and presently disappearing. At a short distance, two others, evidently not belonging to the other lot, remained by themselves. I thought, writes Sverdrup, it would be interesting to go across to them if possible and see what they were about, but realized I must make use of other tactics if I would approach near them. This, I thought, was a fitting moment to impersonate a reindeer or some other kind of big game, and I made a valiant attempt to simulate their grazing movements backwards and forwards on the sward. My tactics were so successful that, in the end, I was not much more than 2 or 3 yards away from them. It was quite touching to see these great innocent Arctic hares sitting only a few paces off, quietly gnawing roots. The only notice they vouchsafed me was an occasional sniff in my direction. I stayed long fraternizing with the hares down on the grass, and at last we did not mind each other in the very least. They went on with their occupations quite unconcernedly, I with mine. I felt something like Adam in paradise before Eve came, and all that about the serpent happened. Hunting expeditions and autumnal sledge journeys at an end, the winter set in with plenty of work to do for everyone on board the Fram. The smithy was called upon for endless labor. The taking of observations and the many other daily occupations caused the long Arctic night to pass with less monotony and depression. A visitation from wolves added excitement to the winter, and various methods were tried for their capture. The explorations of 1901 proved Heiberg Land to be an island, separated by Eureka Strait. This was explored as far as its junction with Greely Fjord, but another year remained before the Norwegian standard was carried to 81 degrees, 37 minutes north, 92 degrees west, where it was raised May 13, 1902, and the outline of coast completed to Aldrich's farthest. Having made one of the most brilliant records in Arctic history, the members of the Fram's second polar expedition turned toward their native land, and on August 6, 1902, the Fram began her triumphant retreat from the Great White North. Homeward. What a strange ring in the simple word, cries Captain Sverdrup. On our long and laborious sledge journeys, we had many a time used it when we thought of the Fram, and a good home the Fram had been these 4 years, warm and strong and well provided. But that was in another way. Now the longing for home coursed through our blood, and all the yearning, which we had thrust aside during these long years, broke loose, rang in our ears, and made our hearts beat faster. Half-forgotten memories and dawning hopes came back again. A sea of thoughts streamed in on us, and tied our tongues in the midst of the joy at going home. It was a moment full of promise, when we knew that we were looking for the last time on these mountains and fjords, which for so long had been the object and scene of our endeavor. September 26, the Fram reached Kristiansand, and 2 days later she dropped anchor for a few hours at Langrenden, off Horten. Quite a fleet of steamers and sailing boats escorted her from Stavanger to Christiania, which was reached on a beautiful Sunday, which recalled to us the day 4 years since when we had gone the other way. So the Fram's second polar expedition was at an end, concludes Captain Sverdrup. An approximate area of 100,000 square miles had been explored, and in the name of the Norwegian king, taken possession of. If the members of the expedition have been able to do anything, this is owing, in the first instance, to the sacrifices of generous Norwegians. That we have not done more is, at any rate, not owing to want of will. The successful navigation of the long-sought Northwest Passage by Captain Roald Amundsen has been one of the stirring events of the early 20th century. Of this hardy Norseman and what he accomplished, Mr. Alger gives an interesting account in Putnam's Magazine. Born July 16, 1872, at Borge, in the district of Smalenene, southern Norway, he comes from an old seafaring family and has had much experience as a sailor. As an officer, he took part in the Belgian South Pole expedition of 1897 on board the Belgica, and it was down in the Antarctic regions that he first planned his famous Arctic voyage. On the whaler Joa, a ship of only 46 tons, he left Christiania in May 1903 with a crew of 7 men, and 3 years later, in the summer of 1906, the news was spread over the world that he had accomplished what no man before him had succeeded in doing. He had not only sailed through the Northwest Passage, but had located the magnetic pole and otherwise gathered much scientific information of the greatest value in regard to these little-known regions. The Joa was especially strengthened and refitted throughout. She was amply provisioned for 5 years, and her crew most carefully selected. Second in command was Lieutenant Godfred Hansen of the Danish Navy. First mate Otto Lund of Tromsø had had long years of service in the sealing trade. Petter Ristrad, a sergeant in the Norwegian Army, was first engineer. Helmer Hansen, also an experienced sealer, a good snowshoer and hunter, was second mate. Gustav Juel, second engineer, was to take part in the magnetic observations, but he died on the trip from pneumonia in March 1906. Adolf Lindström served as cook, having served in the same capacity aboard the Fram. Sailing at midnight, June 16, 1903, from Christiania, Cape Farewell, Greenland, was sighted 5 weeks later. Securing 10 fine dogs at Godhaven from Herr Dongad Jensen, inspector for North Greenland, they entered Melville Bay August 8. On August 15, they came in sight of Dalrymple Rock. At this point, 2 Scotch whaling captains, Milne and Adams, had deposited certain stores for Amundsen. The Joa was unexpectedly met in kayaks by members of the Danish literary Greenland expedition, Herr Milius Eriksson and Herr Knut Rasmussen. An exchange of courtesies was followed by the loading of the Joa with the packages from Dalrymple Rock. Pushing through the lanes at full steam, they emerged into open water in Baffin Bay and later entered Lancaster Sound, anchoring at Beechy August 22. On August 24, they pushed into Peel Sound. The efficiency of the compass now ceased, and they were compelled to navigate by the stars whenever they appeared through the fog which prevailed most of the time. Passing along the west coast of Boothia, Felix, they came to grief by grounding on September 1 and were obliged to lighten the ship by throwing overboard the greater part of the deck cargo. On Saturday, September 12, entered Joa Harbor, a small landlocked cove at the head of Peterson Bay, King William Land, and here they remained for nearly 2 years. Immediate preparations were made for wintering, provisions landed, observatories erected, and Amundsen at once began his valuable scientific observations. In order to ensure accuracy, writes General Greeley in the Century, 1907, the magnetic instruments were installed in temporary wooden buildings built with copper nails and entirely free of any iron, heat, or even light, except the lamp behind the reflector. Here, day and night for 20 months, were made photographed records, and these were supplemented by personal eye readings to serve as needful checks on those photographically obtained. The observers in this work were clothed entirely in deerskin garments, and before entering the building where the magnetometers were installed, carefully divested themselves of watches, keys, knives, and other metallic objects. The observations were made in winter under such conditions of cold, monotony, and darkness as to merit the highest commendation for endurance and constancy. And he continues, the value of the continuous observations at Joa Harbor was largely increased by similar observations in the field, which necessarily entailed severe exposure and consequent hardships on the sledging parties. In March 1904, a preliminary journey, made for the purpose of establishing food depots, involved much suffering owing to excessive cold, the temperature falling to 79 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The sledge journey to the magnetic pole itself was made by Amundsen and Ristvedt, starting April 2, 1904, with 10 dogs and 2 sledges, much difficulty resulting from rough ice. 5 observation stations were occupied between Joa Harbor and Tasmania Islands, which are about 80 miles directly north of Ross's magnetic pole. This field work occupied about 2 months, being summarily finished at the end of May owing to loss of food through the thieving Ichneumthorix of eastern Boothia. While no definite result of the field observations can yet be given, it is not thought that there has been any decided change from the magnetic conditions observed by Ross in 1831, when the pole of declination was in the neighborhood of Cape Adelaide, 70 degrees 5 minutes north, 96 degrees 44 minutes west. On April 1, 1905, Lieutenant Hansen and Ristvedt, with 2 sledges, 12 dogs, and provisions for 3 months, visited Victoria, and after charting half of the missing coastline, returned June 24. Neighbors were not lacking these isolated white men. Frequent visits from Eskimos and the news of American fishermen to the south permitted of letters being forwarded by Eskimos. On August 14, 1906, all conditions being favorable, the Joa weighed anchor and proceeded westward in open water, and within a few hours had successfully passed through Etta Sound, the narrowest place in the Northwest Passage, a tortuous channel between Etta Island and the mainland. The following day they threaded their way through a group of newly discovered islands in shallows that constantly necessitated the use of the lead. A heavy pack was encountered in Victoria Strait, but they continued on their way through the strait between Victoria Land and the mainland, thence through Dease Strait and Coronation Gulf, out into Dolphin and Union Straits, and on the morning of August 25 sighted Nelson Head, a tall and imposing headland. Having successfully passed from the Atlantic side into the Pacific side, the Joa had the good fortune to speak on the same day the American whaling schooner Charles Hanson from San Francisco. A delay of 24 hours was caused by the ice off Cape Bathurst. Near Bailey Island, several beset whalers were encountered, and the barks Alexander and Bowhead were sighted off Pullen Island. Cape Sabine was reached September 2, but progress was only made to King Point, about 35 miles east of Herschel Island, where the Joa was forced to put in another Arctic winter. On October 13, Amundsen, with a sledge and 5 dogs, made a journey of 5 months' duration, covering a distance of 1,500 miles to Eagle City, Alaska. This included a 2-month sojourn in Eagle City, when all dispatches were forwarded and mails received for himself and other members of the expedition. The following August, the Joa was freed, but on the 19th of that month she received a bad injury to her propeller by grounding on a piece of ice, so continued her journey entirely under sail. She arrived at San Francisco October 19 with a rich cargo of ethnographical, zoological, and botanical specimens, and many furs and curios. These were freighted to Christiania, the Joa taken charge of by Admiral Lyons, Commandant of the Mare Island Navy Yard, and Amundsen and his companions started by rail for home. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Katerina. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 23. Robert E. Peary, The Man. First visit to the Arctic, 1886. Other journeys, 1891. Independence Bay, Greenland. Discovers Melville Land and Helpern Land. Subsequent journeys, 1893 through 1895. Discovery of famous Iron Mountain. Summer voyages, 1896 to 1897. North Pole journey of 1898. Peary seriously disabled by frostbites. Polar expedition in SS Roosevelt, 1905 through 1906. Final dash for the pole, 1908. For nearly a quarter of a century, the name of Robert Edwin Peary has been closely identified with Arctic work. No man in the history of exploration has renewed his attacks upon the impassable barriers of the Great White North with such perseverance, endurance, and determination. Again and again, in the face of disappointments, bodily disablements, failures, and discouragements that would have blasted the most sanguine hopes of the average man, he has persisted in his endeavors, returned to the field of action, fought gallantly the disheartening fight, come back to receive the polite indifference or enthusiastic praise of his countrymen, turned his energies to raising the necessary funds to renew his enterprise, and when this was done, faced to the north and passed again beyond the Arctic Circle. He is typically American, tall, lean, wiry, muscular, keen-eyed, alert, positive, and possessed of that indomitable will which conquers or dies. Born in Crescent, Pennsylvania, May 6, 1856, he had early the misfortune to lose his father, and his widowed mother, with a boy of 3, returned to her relatives and friends in New England and made her home in Portland, Maine. Here Peary the lad grew up, fond of the sea and the woods, loving the wild roar of the ocean as it beat upon the rocky coast, or the gentle summer winds whispering amid the northern pines. He loved to roam, to explore, to find adventure, and to lead others to it, and in his schoolboy days he was noted for his athletic tastes and powers of endurance. At 21 years of age he completed his college life at Bowdoin, graduating second in a class of 51, and 4 years later had passed the examinations which made him civil engineer in the United States Navy. From duty in Florida he was transferred to the Nicaragua Canal Zone, where he remained engaged in the Inter-Ocean Ship Canal Survey from 1884 to 1885. He returned under government orders to Washington in the fall of that year, and during a leisure hour in an old bookstore, he accidentally came upon a paper on the inland ice of Greenland. Remembering the adventures of Dr. Kane, which had thrilled him as a boy, and reading the experiences of Nordenskjöld, Jensen, and the rest, Peary felt he must know for himself what was the truth of this great mysterious interior. Thus early had the seed of ambition to explore the land of the mysterious North germinated in his active mind. The following year he received permission from the Department for Leave of Absence to make a reconnaissance of the Greenland ice cap, east of Disco Bay, 70 degrees north latitude. Accompanied by Christian Maygard, a Dane and 8 natives, Peary examined the coast and fjords, penetrated the inland ice, and visited, among other interesting spots, the Tosukatek Glacier, the base of Narrasok Peninsula, and the fossil beds of Atainkutloch. Here, he says, I found fragments of trees, black petrifications with the grain of the wood and the texture of the bark showing clearly. Pieces of sandstone split readily into sheets, between which were to be seen sharp, clear impressions of large net-veined leaves, every tiniest veinlet and minute serratum of the edges distinct as the lines of a steel engraving. Long, slender, parallel-veined leaves and exquisite feathery forms. Full of enthusiasm for further adventure in the land of desolation, where the wild, vivid poppy flourishes in sheltered nooks, near eternal glaciers, where a lifeless desert of perpetual snow from 5,000 to 10,000 feet above the level of the sea extends over an area of some 1,200 miles in length and 500 in width, a glistening shroud, covering the mighty rocks of ages, the buried summits of high mountains thousands of feet below. Peary returned to the United States and in a newspaper article attracted the attention of the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, which offered to defray part of the expense of his second expedition. Peary left June 6, 1891 in the Kite, and with his party, including Mrs. Peary, Langdon Gibson, ornithologist and hunter, Dr. Frederick A. Cook, surgeon, Eyvind Astrup, a Norwegian, John M. Verhoff, mineralogist and meteorologist, and Matthew Hansen, a colored man, landed at McCormick Bay in August. An unfortunate accident aboard the Kite, which resulted in a broken leg, caused Peary disappointment and delay in carrying out his autumn plans. However, Red Cliff House was erected, communications with the natives established, and such work carried on as Peary's unfortunate condition would permit. In April 1892, Peary, being fully restored to health, left Red Cliff House and explored Inglefield Gulf. His next move was to establish caches of provisions to be used on a sledge journey across the ice cap. This journey was undertaken in May. 4 sledges, to which were harnessed 16 dogs, carried the provisions and equipment. A supporting party advanced with Peary to a point about 100 miles from McCormick Bay. The explorer with one companion, Astrup, proceeded over the great ice at an elevation of about 5,000 feet, and by May 31st looked down into Paterman Fjord. Here, says Peary, we were on the ice bluffs forming the limit of the great glacier basin, just as we had been on Humboldt, but a trifle less fortunate here than on Humboldt. I found it necessary to deflect some 10 miles to the eastward, to avoid the inequalities of the glacier basin, and the great crevasses which cut the ice bluffs encircling it. Peary's object now was to make the east coast of Greenland, following the edge of the ice cap, beset with crevices, slippery ice, hummocks, drifting snow and fogs, and the journey was continued until July 4, 1892, when they reached Independence Bay, 81 degrees 37 minutes north latitude. An ascent of Navy Cliff revealed a magnificent panorama of rugged, majestic, ice-free country to the north, and the broad expanse of the East Greenland Ocean. Strange it seemed that in this remote country in sheltered nooks the flowers bloomed, the hum of bees, the drone of flies fell upon the ear. The snow bunting, the sandpiper, a Greenland falcon, and a pair of ravens greeted the adventurers. Musk ox fed upon the patches of greensward, and no less than 5 fell to Peary's rifle and supplied men and dogs with abundant meat. The return journey back to McCormick Bay, a distance of some 450 miles, was made over the ice cap in the face of violent storms and wind, through drifts and fog, with diminished provisions and failing dogs. A joyful meeting with Professor Halprin and party, who had come north a month before with a kite, took place on the inland ice, at the head of McCormick Bay, and a happy return was made to Red Cliff House. The results of Peary's second voyage to the Arctic, embracing the great 1,200-mile journey, determined the northern extension and insularity of Greenland, made the discovery of detached ice-free landmasses of less extent to the northward, and established the rapid convergence of the Greenland shores above the 78th parallel. It also included the discovery of Melville Land and Halprin Land, and the accumulation of most valuable scientific data, besides laying the foundation for Peary's comprehensive study of the Greenland Highlanders or native Eskimo. Immediately upon his return to the United States, Peary devoted his energies to a lecture tour from which he hoped to derive the necessary funds to promote a more extended exploration of northeast Greenland. Granted 3 years' leave of absence by the Honorary B.F. Tracy, Secretary of the Navy, the North Greenland expedition of 1893 to 1894 sailed on the Falcon, June 1893, and entered the mouth of Bowdoin Bay in Inglefield Gulf August 3rd. Here a house was rapidly constructed, stores landed, the Falcon making a brief trip after the winter supply of meat, with a stop at Lifeboat Cove, where a visit was made to the site of Polaris House. A few relics were picked up, bearing the stamp of the United States Navy Yard at Washington, dated 1865 to 1870. The 20th of August, after her return to the station at Bowdoin Bay, the Falcon steamed south, leaving the little group of 14 persons, including, among others, Mr. and Mrs. Peary, Mr. Samuel J. Entrekin, Eyvind Astrup, Dr. Edward E. Vincent, Mr. E. B. Baldwin, Mrs. Susan J. Cross, and the colored man, Matthew Hansen. On September 12, in this faraway land, the famous Snow Baby was born, little blue-eyed Marie Aniguito Peary, and bundled deep in soft, warm Arctic furs and wrapped in the Stars and Stripes. In early March 1894, the last preparations were completed for a second 1,200-mile journey across the Greenland ice cap. On the 6th of the month, accompanied by 8 men, 12 sledges, and 92 dogs, Peary ascended the inland ice. The advance of such a caravan was slow and heavy. The dogs of the various teams, being unaccustomed to one another, were constantly fighting. The penetrating cold nipped with frostbites the hands and feet of these men, so that after an advance of 134 miles, at an elevation of 5,500 feet, Peary determined at the end of 13 days to cache surplus stores, send back the majority of his men, and proceed with 3 men alone. But the conditions of cold and storms were too adverse for human endurance, the thermometer reaching as low as -60 degrees. The dogs were reduced to a most pitiable condition, many dying from exposure. On April 10, having advanced only about 85 miles, Peary decided it was inadvisable to attempt to proceed and prepared for his return to Bowdoin Bay. Abandoning and caching all unnecessary impedimenta, with only 26 dogs remaining out of the original number, the party reached the station in a much enfeebled and reduced state. Though temporarily defeated in the main object of his enterprise, Peary had gleaned much information concerning the famous Iron Mountain of Melville Bay, first mentioned by Captain Ross in 1818, and as part of the program he had laid down for himself, a visit to that interesting spot was undertaken. On May 27, 1894, Peary located this remarkable meteorite, leaving a cairn with records at a short distance from the spot. In the meantime, Astrup had made a successful sledge journey in reconnaissance of Melville Bay, and carefully charting much of its hitherto little-known northeastern shore. The last of July, the Falcon, with a party of scientists aboard, including, among others, Professor T.C. Chamberlain, Professor Wim Libby, Jr., H.L. Bridgman, and Mrs. Peary's brother, Emil Dibbich, anchored in McCormick Bay. After a sojourn in northern waters, they returned to the United States, carrying on board the entire Peary party, with the exception of the indomitable leader and 2 companions, Lee and Hansen. Peary's resources were limited. Food and fuel were reduced so as to menace future activities, and the visit of a relief ship in the summer of 1895 depended practically upon Mrs. Peary's sole exertions. Nevertheless, Peary determined to remain, and, immediately enlisting the natives to assist him, he drew on the country for his supplies. The fall was occupied in the chase after reindeer and Arctic hare for human food and walrus meat for the dogs, and later in examination and rehabilitation of the nearer caches of provisions left on the inland ice. The monotonous winter passed, and as the spring advanced, the day of departure approached for the next great journey across the Greenland ice. On April 2, 1895, the little band, consisting of its intrepid leader with Lee and Hansen, 4 natives, and the 6 sledges with their dog teams, started northward. The fierce storms of winter had obliterated the marked caches. In vain was the immediate neighborhood scoured in every direction, sometimes to a distance of 5 miles. No signs of the looked-for depots could be discovered. Though Eskimos deserted and turned back, Peary still pushed on, at last left with only the 2 companions, some 40 dogs, and 3 sledges. The prospect was indeed dismal. Lee became disabled by frostbites, the dogs died, the gaunt form of starvation loomed on the horizon. May 8th, Lee could proceed no farther and was left in camp, distant some 16 miles from the coast, while Peary and Hansen advanced in the desperate search for game. 4 days and nights death by starvation faced them in the fruitless search for food. Then, disappointed, back to camp and a desperate march to Independence Bay. Then down the tortuous valley, across rocks, cobble, and boulder, the men plunged on. A few miles beyond the valley, I saw a fresh hare track, says Peary, and a few hundred yards beyond came upon the hare itself, squatting among the rocks a few paces distant. With the sight of the beautiful, spotless little animal, the feeling of emptiness in the region of my stomach increased. I called to Matt, who was some little distance back, to stop the dogs and come up with his rifle. He was so affected by the prospect of a good supper, his first and second bullets missed the mark, but at the third the white object collapsed into a shapeless mass, and on the instant gaunt hunger leapt upon us like a wolf upon its prey. It was the first full meal we had had since the Eskimos left us 35 days ago. Later musk ox fell to the hunter's aim, which restored courage and strength to the desperate men. They reached the cairn which Peary had erected in 1892 and found the papers there still intact. To linger in the vicinity meant a constant consumption of food for which they were not prepared. There was yet the long journey back over the dread ice cap, 8,000 feet above the level of the sea. With 9 dogs and food for 17 days only, they retraced their steps, fleeing in forced marches from that ever-present gaunt form, starvation, closing upon their wake. One by one the faithful dogs died by the wayside. This retreat over the great ice is one of the most desperate struggles in Arctic history. At last, June 25, the 3 starving, exhausted men reached Bowdoin Bay. At the beginning of the last day there were left 4 biscuits saved from the half and quarter rations of the preceding weeks, and 1 dog was still alive, the sole survivor of a pack of 42. "Poor brute," says Peary. The memory of those famine days upon the great ice remained so vividly with him that for weeks after our return, though weak and afflicted like ourselves, he might be seen at any time when not asleep, hiding away every bit of meat or blubber and every bone that he could find about the place. A few weeks of recuperation fitted the men for the journey home, and relief ship Kite, in charge of Captain Bartlett, reached them in early August. In 1896 and 1897, Peary made 2 summer voyages to the Arctic for the purpose of transferring to the United States the largest of the 3 Cape York meteorites. On the first trip, he was successful in dislodging this 90-ton mass from the ice grip of centuries, but was compelled to leave it until the next season, when he successfully had it transferred to the hold of the Hope, the Peary ship of that year, and the World Wonder now reposes in the Museum of Natural History, New York City. During these active years, Peary had made warm friends, men who had said to him with the same confidence expressed by Theodore Roosevelt, "I believe in you, Peary," and the Peary Arctic Club was formed, headed by that generous benefactor, Morris K. Jessup, as president, Frederick E. Hyde, vice president, Henry W. Cannon, treasurer, and Herbert L. Bridgman, secretary, and others to lend encouragement and financial aid. Peary's ambitions had not been satisfied by his brilliant achievements in twice crossing the Greenland ice cap, and the lure of the Arctic had long beckoned him to try to reach the northernmost extremity of the earth. His journey of 1898 to 1902 under the auspices of the Peary Arctic Club had for its main purpose the attainment of the pole itself. His carefully laid plan was to advance toward the pole by the west coast of Greenland and establish food stations, depending upon picked Eskimos for cooperation with his small party. In the final dash, supporting sledges would be sent back as soon as emptied, and the returning explorer with 2 companions would be met by a relief party of Eskimos. Mr. Harmsworth of London generously gave his yacht, the Windward, for this expedition. Peary started with every prospect of success. The Windward endeavored to force a passage into Kennedy Channel, but was obliged to seek shelter in winter quarters at Cape Dorval. In earlier autumnal journeys, Peary determined the continuity of Ellesmere and Grinnell lands, and prepared to make his headquarters at Fort Conger. In January 1899 came a sudden and most disheartening setback to his ambitious plans. While on this dangerous sledge journey, in a frightful temperature that ranged between 51 to 63 degrees below zero, he had both feet badly frozen, and this grave injury, which nearly cost him his life, resulted in the amputation of 8 toes, but not before weeks of suffering had been passed in the melancholy winter darkness at Greely's old quarters. "During the following weeks," writes Peary, "our life at Conger was pronouncedly a la Robinson Crusoe. Searching for things in the unbroken darkness of the great night with a tiny flicker of flame in a saucer was very like seeking a needle in a haystack. At last, on the 18th of February, in the moonlight, they started back to the ship. Lashed firmly down, with feet and legs wrapped in musk ox skin, Peary was dragged in the cold Arctic night, a distance of 250 miles in 11 days. Disheartening weeks of inaction and suffering aboard the Windward but partially restored his health. Nevertheless, in April, while still on crutches, he was dragged on sledges to Fort Conger. This season was passed in scientific work and map-making. While crossing Ellesmere Land ice cap in July at an elevation of 7,000 feet, Peary discovered Cannon Bay. Other results of his indefatigable endeavors were the collecting of relics of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, which were sent home by the Windward. The sextant and record of the Nares expedition were also found and sent back to be presented to the Lords of the Admiralty of Great Britain, and placed in the Museum of the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. Each season a vessel was sent to Greenland to carry him supplies and bring back letters. Small parties of scientists, university students, and hunters took advantage of the opportunity to sail north and be left at various points to be called for on the vessel's return. In 1899, Dr. Robert Stein of the United States Geological Survey, Dr. Leopold Ken of Cornell, and Mr. Samuel Wormbath had taken passage in the Peary supply ship Diana for explorations in Ellesmere Land. In the fall of 1899, the Windward returned to the United States, leaving Peary in Etah, where he remained until the following March, when he journeyed to Fort Conger and from there made his northern dash in an attempt to reach the pole. The explorer followed closely the route laid down by Brainard and Lockwood, and on May 8 beat their record. Later he reached the most northern point of land, to which he gave the name of Cape Morris KG sub, 83 degrees 39 minutes north. From this point his travel was over the disintegrating polar pack, in advance of ridges of heavy ice thrown up to heights of 25 to 50 feet, crevices and holes masked by snow, the whole intersected by narrow leads of open water. Having reached 83 degrees 54 minutes north, he then returned to Cape Morris G-sub and followed the coast of Melville Land for some distance, then returned south. In 1901 he attempted another northern journey, but found advance impossible after reaching Lincoln Bay. Undaunted by failure, his next attempt was made in February 1902 and reached April 21st, 84 degrees 17 minutes north, but again he was forced back after risking his own life and that of his companions over the worst ice he had ever encountered. Momentarily discouraged, he wrote at this time, "The game is off. My dream of 16 years is ended. I have made the best fight I knew. I believe it has been a good one, but I cannot accomplish the impossible." After 4 years of strenuous endeavor in the face of the most disheartening failure, Peary came back to the United States, took courage once more, renewed the losing fight, and planned his 7th voyage into the Arctic. Under the auspices of the Peary Arctic Club, a model ship was built for the sole purpose of assisting Peary in accomplishing the work upon which he had set his heart, lavished his fortune, and staked the confidence of his friends. The result was the building of the Roosevelt, the most modern of ice fighters. The plans for the Roosevelt allowed a length of 184 by 35 feet beam and 16 feet draft, loaded. She was provided with engines capable of developing 1,000 horsepower. She carried a light 3-masted schooner rig. Her hull was especially designed to resist the terrific pressure of the ice floes and of such shape to lift easily from the treacherous ice cradles in which she was expected to test her resisting qualities. In this splendid craft, Peary started north in 1905 and boldly plowed the Roosevelt farther than any vessel had yet penetrated, reaching nearly 82 degrees 30 minutes north latitude on the north coast of Grant Land. The Roosevelt wintered at Cape Sheridan, and from this high latitude Peary started in February 1906 for the pole. Everything seemed favorable: improved equipment, Eskimo assistant, well-laid caches, and Peary himself full of the eternal vigor which, in spite of years of hardship, gave to his mind and body the elasticity of youth. On, across the interminable obstacles. On, past 1 degree and then another, with the ever-present problem of cold, storm, rough ice, and diminishing food, until finally the forces of nature baffled once again the forces of human strength. At 87 degrees 6 minutes, the uncompromising voices of the north cried out, "This far shalt thou come, and no farther." Back once more, step by step, over hummock, crevice, and floe, over thin and treacherous ice, across the big lead whose thin, undulating surface, some 2 miles in width, barely supported the weight of a man in his frantic race with death. Back once more to the south, baffled once more in his schemes, but sterner than ever in the purpose to die or win, because the thing he has set himself to do is a part of his being. Peary returned to the United States, the plans of his 8th and final journey already maturing in his mind. The Roosevelt was docked for the purpose of repairs. Funds for this last journey were slow in forthcoming. Every expedient was tried, but, though a substantial sum was raised, there still lacked money to complete the work, provision and equip the expedition, and to pay the current expenses of the trip. In the midst of these perplexing problems, Peary received another blow in the news of the death of Mr. Morris K. Jessup, his most liberal supporter. With his death all seemed lost. The darkest hour of discouragement had come. Delays of months meant perhaps the delay of years, or possibly the entire abandonment of this last voyage. The Voyage of the Forlorn Hope. Proverbially, the darkest hour is just before dawn, and the Peary Arctic Club, under its new president, General Thomas H. Hubbard, received a liberal check, tendered by Mr. Zenas Crane, the paper manufacturer of Massachusetts, which suddenly rent asunder the somber clouds and showed once more their silver lining. Relieved of the mental anxiety which had been his constant companion for months, Peary now hurried his final preparations, and, rejoicing in his good fortune, steamed out of New York Harbor July 6, 1908, in the gallant Roosevelt, with her pennants flying bravely to the breeze. Peary, now grown old in Arctic service, sailed to the Great White North, this time to reach his goal. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Great White North. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Brandon Mitchell. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 24. Dr. Frederick A. Cook claims discovery of the pole. His return from the Arctic. Reception by the Danes. Announcement of conquest of the pole by Peary. Denounces Dr. Cook. Delay of Dr. Cook to produce his data. Acceptance of Peary's claims by the American Geographical Society. Dr. Cook finally sends manuscript to Copenhagen. Verdict. Prior claim to the discovery of the North Pole, not proven. The announcement in the New York Herald on September 1, 1909 of the discovery of the North Pole by Dr. Frederick A. Cook of Brooklyn, New York, astounded the civilized world. For some years, Dr. Cook's name had been associated with Arctic enterprise, but to the majority of the public his name was strange. In the summer of 1907, Cook had accompanied Mr. John R. Bradley in the gentleman's yacht in an excursion after big game beyond the Arctic Circle. Later, Mr. Bradley sailed home, leaving Cook with a fair supply of provisions and equipment and one white companion, a German-American named Frankie. On March 8, 1908, Cook left Anuktok accompanied by 11 men and 103 dogs with the avowed purpose of reaching the pole. Frankie remained at Anuktok with instructions to return to the United States in case Cook did not return by June 1908. News of Cook's departure for the North Pole had meanwhile aroused interest in the United States. One of the objects of Commander Peary's expedition of 1908 was the relief and rescue of Dr. Frederick A. Cook. The big supply station at Etah was, in fact, established by him mainly for the benefit of Dr. Cook. When the Roosevelt and the Eric arrived at Anuktok in August 7, 1908, Frankie was found in a pitiable condition and he begged to be sent home. He was returned in the Eric, commanded by Captain Bartlett, and from St. John's, Newfoundland, sent out the news that Cook had probably perished on his way to the pole. This announcement aroused so much interest that early in August 1909, a relief ship left St. John's for the purpose of searching for Dr. Cook and for carrying provisions to Peary. News traveled slowly north of 53, and meanwhile, Cook had returned. In April 1909, a white man and two Eskimos appeared at the relief station at Anuktok, the station immediately north of Etah. The three were utterly fatigued and were made as comfortable as possible by the men whom Commander Peary had left behind. A few days later, Cook left Anuktok for South Greenland, whence he took steamer for Copenhagen. Dispatches from the Shetland Islands the last of August 1909 proclaimed that Dr. Cook had reached the pole in April 1908. Cook declared his route to have been by Smith Sound across Ellesmere Land to Nansen Sound to Land's End, thence by Cape Thomas Hubbard, which he left in March 1908, to the pole 460 miles distant, which he claims to have reached on April 21, 1908. The familiar story of his welcome at Copenhagen needs not to be retold here. Meanwhile came a dispatch to the New York Times. I have the pole, April 6. Expect arrive Chateau Bay, September 7. Secure control wire for me there and arrange expedite transmission. Big story. Peary. At Battle Harbor, Commander Peary learned of Cook's claim to have reached the pole. But Peary had carried northward a number of Eskimos with their wives and children and those he had led safely back again to Etah. However, the Greenland winter was approaching, and he lingered at Etah, organizing a walrus hunt which supplied his faithful company with food for the coming year. Not till this provision was made did he set his face toward the United States. A shadow of doubt hardly bigger than a man's hand, which was cast by part of the scientific world at the doctor's first announcement, soon grew into what eventually proved to be a cloudburst. No controversy in the history of modern times has caused more general excitement. Soon the two principals were pursuing their separate activities under very dissimilar conditions. Dr. Cook was lecturing in the United States, facing packed houses, interviewing reporters, asserting his claims, promising proofs of his assertion. Peary preferred to present his own claims to the discovery of the pole in terse language, the first announcement published in the New York Times, reading, "Summary of North Polar Expedition of the Peary Arctic Club. The steamer Roosevelt left New York on August 6, 1908, left Sydney July 17, arrived at Cape York, Greenland, August 1. Left Etah, Greenland, August 8. Arrived Cape Sheridan at Grantland, September 1. Wintered at Cape Sheridan. The sledge expedition left the Roosevelt February 15, 1909, and started for the north. Arrived at Cape Columbia, March 1. Passed British record, March 2. Delayed by open water, March 2 and 3. Held up by open water, March 4 to 11. Crossed the 84th parallel, March 11. Encountered open lead, March 15. Crossed 85th parallel, March 18. Crossed 86th parallel, March 23. Encountered open lead, March 23. Passed Norwegian record, March 23. Passed Italian record, March 24. Encountered open lead, March 26, crossed 87th parallel, March 27. Passed American record, March 28. Encountered open lead, March 28. Held up by open water, March 29. Crossed 88th parallel, April 2. Crossed 89th parallel, April 4. North Pole, April 6th. All returning left North Pole, April 7. Reached Cape Columbia, April 23. Arriving on board Roosevelt, April 27. The Roosevelt left Cape Sheridan, July 18, passed Cape Sabine, August 8, left Cape York, August 26, arrived at Indian Harbor with all members of the expedition returning in good health, except Professor Ross G. Marvin, unfortunately drowned April 10 when 45 miles north of Cape Columbia, returning from 86 degrees north latitude in command of the supporting party. Robert E. Peary. Immediately upon his return to the United States, Peary joined his family at their summer home in Maine, offering to submit his proofs at once to any competent body. The National Geographic Society, accepting the offer, pronounced favorably upon his claims. In the meantime, he took no active part in the trend of affairs, but waited quietly for the dust to settle. In November, Dr. Cook canceled his lecture engagements and settled down to preparing the long-delayed proofs to be submitted as promised to the University of Copenhagen. This accomplished, he dispatched a typewritten copy to the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. After careful deliberation, the University of Copenhagen rendered its verdict to the world, which, summarized in 2 short words, left the claim of Dr. Frederick A. Cook to the discovery of the North Pole, April 21, 1908, not proven. End of chapter 24. Conclusion. For 23 years, Robert Edwin Peary has knocked valiantly at the portals of immortal fame. The castle nowhere, whose glistening walls of eternal ice lie shimmering in the brilliant sun, whose jeweled towers and minarets catch the glint of sparkling rainbows. The gates at last have opened and the banquet hall is set. Wild Arctic melodies fall grandly upon the ear. The cannonade of glaciers thunder a salute. About the festive board stand the heroes of the past, according to their precedence and rank. Hail ye, Iva Beardson, hail, ye early Norsemen and ye Danes. There stand the Cabots, John the Father, Sebastian the bold son. There Sir Willoughby and Chancellor, and old Sir Humphrey Gilbert and a host of others. Their Barents, their bearing, They're Henry Hudson and Old Baffin. 3 hearty cheers for Vaughan, Wrangel, Ross, and Peary, and brave old Sir John Franklin. Crozier and his men line at attention and salute. Ah, Elijah Kane, the beauty of a noble soul lies written in a gentle face. Francis Hall, thou dreamer, stand forth and welcome the arriving guest. German, Austrian, Norwegian, and Italian, stand thou behind the board, lift high the diamond chalice, and quaff the limpid draught in honor of the hero, for he comes. In one voice, down the ages goes the cry. All praise to him who conquers, and Peary, entering, bows and takes his seat. End of conclusion. End of The Great White North by Helen S. Wright.